year was 1858, and the sky over Juniper Flats was bleeding. It was a sunset of judgment, the kind that bled red fire and molten copper, silhouetting the jagged peaks of the Vermilion Range as if they were teeth against a raw wound. Down below, the world was parched, cracked, and waiting. The drought had held the territory in its fist for 3 bone-dry months, and the alkali dust, fine as flour, coated everything with a pale shroud. Rowan Hale, 29 years old and owner of the Kestrel Bluff Ranch by grit and grief, felt the dust in her throat, her eyes, and the lines of her palms. She rode her mare, Dust Finch, at a walk, too tired for anything more. The horse's head hung low, and its hooves raised only faint, weary puffs from the baked earth. It had been a long day, a day spent chasing down 3 stray calves, their ribs already sharp under their hides, and turning them back from the dry, poisoned bed of what used to be Coyote Creek. Her homestead was not a grand thing. It was a sturdy, sod-walled house, built by her father's hands, a corral of sun-bleached cottonwood, and a barn that leaned just slightly to the north, as if bracing against the wind that never came. And there, in the center of the hard-packed yard, was the ranch's heart, its only reason for being, the stone well. It was deep, cut 60 feet into the rock, and it had never run dry. It was the only reliable water in 20 miles. Rowan swung her leg over the saddle, her canvas trousers stiff with sweat and grime. She didn't groan as she landed. She'd learned long ago that the high desert didn't care for complaints. Her body ached, a low, thrumming exhaustion from the sun's relentless hammer. All she wanted was to water Dust Finch, draw a bucket for her own supper, and bar the door against the vast, lonely dark. She led the mare to the trough, her boots scuffing the silence, and then she stopped. The air was wrong. It wasn't the clean scent of juniper and dry pine. Beneath the dust, another smell clung to the heavy, hot air. It was the sharp, metallic tang of copper, the salt scent of waste. Her eyes, accustomed to the subtle shifts of the landscape, scanned the yard. Nothing. The barn was quiet. The corral was empty, save for the steers she'd left penned. Then she saw it, on the pale, flat lip of the stone well. A dark smear glistened wetly in the dying light. Her hand moved without thought, not to her pistol, but to the Winchester rifle still resting in the saddle scabbard. She drew it, the oiled steel sliding out with a soft, lethal shing. Her exhaustion evaporated, replaced by the cold, clear focus of the frontier. This was not animal blood. Her gaze followed the trail. A single, heavy drop near the well lip, another on the packed earth, and another leading toward the shadowed space between the well and the water trough. It wasn't the scattered spray of a coyote kill, nor the messy drag of a cougar. This was slow. This was human. She moved, her rifle held low, her steps silent. She rounded the heavy stone base of the well. He was huddled there, compressed into the one patch of deep shadow left by the setting sun. He was young, perhaps younger than her, and clearly of the high plateau nation. His black hair was matted with sweat and dust, and his body was coiled tight, his arms wrapped around his middle as if trying to hold himself together. He wore simple buckskin leggings and a torn cotton shirt, clearly not his own. He was a warrior. She could see that by the tension in his shoulders and the hard set of his jaw. But right now, he was just a man brought low. A dark, sodden stain was spreading through his fingers, covering his entire left side. He heard her, or sensed her. His head snapped up. Rowan's breath caught. His eyes met hers, and in them she saw 2 fires warring. One was the fierce, defiant pride of a cornered hawk, wary, sharp, and expecting the final blow. The other was a deeper, older fire, a desperate, agonizing burn. It was a thirst so profound it eclipsed the pain. His lips were cracked, caked with dry dust and blackish blood. He tried to move, to push himself back against the stone, and a low hiss of agony escaped him. His gaze flicked from her rifle back to her face. He said one word, a sound like dry leaves scraping stone. "Water." The word hung in the air, a plea and a command, And in that same instant, another sound joined it. It was faint. A vibration felt more in the soles of her boots than heard with her ears, but it was unmistakable. Hoofbeats. Not one horse, a group, riding fast from the east. Along the flat, Rowan Hale stood frozen, the entire weight of the West pressing down on her in that one terrible second. The equation was simple, brutal, and instant. The man was wounded. The posse was hunting him. To help him was to declare war on the men riding that dust cloud. To help him meant bringing their judgment, their fire, and their rope down on her home. She was one woman, alone, with a dozen steers and a patch of land bought with her parents' lives. To deny him was simple. Shut the door, bar it, let the hunters find their quarry. Let the desert reclaim its own. It was the safe choice, the sane choice. The man's eyes never left hers. He had seen the choice settle on her. He did not beg again. He simply watched her, waiting to see what kind of human she was. The hoofbeats were louder now, a frantic, angry drumming. They were close, maybe 2 minutes out. Rowan thought of the drought. She thought of the cracked earth, the skeletons of cattle she'd passed in the arroyo, the sun that gave life and took it with equal indifference. Her father's voice, a memory from a decade gone, echoed in her mind. You don't deny water, Rowan. Not to man nor beast. It ain't ours to deny. Slowly, deliberately, she lowered the muzzle of the Winchester. She did not set it down completely, but leaned it against the well wall, within reach, but no longer a threat. She turned to the pulley. Her hands, calloused and strong, gripped the rough hemp rope. The man watched, his eyes wide, disbelieving. The wooden bucket scraped against the stone as it descended. The sound was deafening in the twilight. The posse would hear it. They would know someone was at the well. Closer. The drumming was a heartbeat in her throat. The bucket hit the water far below with a hollow thump that echoed up the shaft. She hauled it up, hand over hand, the muscles in her back and shoulders straining. The rope bit into her palms. The bucket emerged, heavy and dripping, black in the twilight, brimming with life. She didn't waste time with the dipper. She lifted the heavy oak bucket, water sloshing over the rim onto her boots. She knelt beside him. He flinched, expecting a blow, or for her to dash the water on the ground before him. Instead, she lifted the heavy rim to his lips. Drink, she commanded, her voice low and steady. For a second, he just stared. Then, a shudder ran through him. He lunged, not with violence, but with a desperate, animal need. His hands came up to grip the bucket, his fingers locking with hers. He drank. It was not a polite sip. It was the sound of a man dying of thirst, a raw, desperate, gulping sound that was more painful than a scream. He choked, coughed, and drank again, water spilling down his chin, washing streaks of pale clarity through the grime and blood on his neck and chest. He drank until the bucket was light, until the last drops fell onto the dust. He sagged back against the stone, his eyes closing, his chest heaving. The water had given him a moment of life, but it had cost him his last reserve of strength. His hand, which had been clutching his side, fell away, and Rowan saw the wound clearly. Her stomach tightened. This was no arrow. This was no lucky shot from a skirmish. The hole in the torn shirt and the flesh beneath was a ragged, ugly star, and haloing it, burned black into the skin and fabric, was a perfect ring of soot, a powder burn. She knew in an instant. This man had been shot at point-blank range. Someone had stood close enough to press the muzzle of a pistol or rifle right against his ribs and pull the trigger. It was an execution. The sharp, acrid smell of spent powder and sulfur, even hours old, was unmistakable. The hoofbeats were in her yard. Rowan Hale!" a voice barked. A voice she knew. The man's eyes snapped open, not with thirst this time, but with a cold, intelligent terror. He fumbled inside his torn shirt, his fingers slick with his own blood. He pulled out a small, oiled leather pouch, no bigger than her palm, and pressed it into her free hand. His grip was weak, but desperate. "Hide," he whispered. The single word a gasp of pain. He gestured to her, then to the approaching men. "Hide it." Her fingers closed around the warm, tacky leather. "Ma'am, show yourself." She stood up, blocking the wounded man from view with her body. The posse had stopped. 7 of them, forming a half circle around her well. They were dark shapes against the last of the sun, their horses snorting and stamping, weary from the hard ride. "Evening, Sheriff," Rowan said, her voice flat. Sheriff Luther Pike dismounted, his boots landing heavy. He was a tall man, built like an anvil, with a face that looked like it had been carved from hard rock and left in the sun too long. "Rowan." His eyes were not friendly. They swept the yard, noting the rifle against the well, the empty bucket, and her. "You alone?" "Same as always." "Sheriff." His gaze dropped to the ground, to the dark, wet mud at her feet, the mud made from spilled water and the steady drip from the man hidden behind the stone. Pike's eyes narrowed. The wounded man, Kalen, pressed himself flatter against the stone, his breathing shallow. Rowan didn't dare look down. She could feel the stiff, folded paper inside the pouch she'd shoved into the waistband of her trousers, digging into her skin. She had given him water, and now the hunters were at her door. The man's words echoed in her head. "Hide it." What was in this pouch that was worth an execution at close range? She looked at Pike, his hand resting on the butt of his holstered pistol, and she knew, whatever it was worth more than her life. The posse was dismounting, fanning out, their eyes cold. The dust they had raised began to settle, choking the air, and the first star of evening burned like a cold silver nail in the darkening sky. The standoff had begun. The 7 riders reined in, their horses breathing hard, flanks dark with sweat. They didn't bunch together but fanned out, creating a loose, threatening semicircle that trapped Rowan between their line and her well. The man leading them, Sheriff Luther Pike, swung down from his saddle with a heavy, deliberate motion. The jingle of his spurs was the only sound in the yard, sharp and metallic in the thick, hot air. Pike was a big man, not soft but dense, like a block of seasoned hardwood. His face was all angles and harsh planes, baked by the sun to the color of old brick, and his eyes, set deep under a heavy brow, were the color of a gunmetal sky. He took off his hat, wiping the sweatband on his sleeve. But it was not a gesture of courtesy. It was the motion of a man taking possession of the space he had just entered. "Ma'am," he said. His voice was a low rumble, flat and devoid of warmth. He didn't look at her. Not directly. His gaze was busy, sweeping the hard-packed earth, noting the rifle, the wet ground, and the dark stain near the well lip. "Sheriff," Rowan answered. Her voice was steady, but she could feel her heart hammering against her ribs, a frantic bird in a small cage. She kept her body positioned, a shield between the posse and the shadows behind the well. She prayed the wounded man, Callan, was keeping absolutely still. Pike's gaze finally settled on the dark, glistening patch of mud and something else. The copper smell was thick now, undeniable. "You're out late, Rowan, and you look flushed." "Just finished. Sheriff, chasing strays. The drought makes him wander." She forced a note of weary frustration into her voice. Pike nodded slowly, his eyes still fixed on the stain. "We ain't looking for strays. We're hunting, tracking a fugitive. A savage." He bit the word off. "Killed a federal officer up near Mesquite Wash. Cut him down. We've been trailing him since noon." Rowan's blood went cold. A federal officer. The pouch in her waistband suddenly felt like a burning coal. The man had called himself a messenger. Pike was calling him a killer. One of them was lying, and the proof was digging into her skin. "An officer," she said, letting just enough shock into her tone. "That's terrible, but I haven't seen anyone. Sheriff, not a soul, just me and my cattle." Pike took a step closer. He was near enough now that she could smell the sour sweat. "Horse," and tobacco on him. He gestured with his chin, not pointing, but the meaning was clear. That's a powerful lot of blood for a stray, ma'am. That ain't cattle blood. Rowan's mind raced. She needed a lie. A good one. One that held water. It wasn't a stray. It was one of my own. A calf. Got sick. Bloat. She hated the lie. Hated the words. It was suffering. I had to put it down. Right here. Pike's eyes flicked to her hip, where her skinning knife remained sheathed and clean. You butchered it. No, she said, shaking her head. It was the sickness. The meat's tainted. I dragged the carcass out past the ridge for the coyotes. Finished not 20 minutes ago. I was just washing up. She pointed to the empty bucket. It was a thin story. Dragging a calf carcass alone at dusk was hard. Messy work. But it was plausible. It explained the blood, the water, the timing. Pike stared at her. The silence stretched, drawn thin and tight as a wire. He was weighing her, measuring her. He knew this land. He knew her. He knew her father had died 2 years back, leaving her to run this place with just her own grit. He was deciding if that grit was strong enough to harbor a fugitive. Sheriff? The voice was thin and reedy, cutting the tension. It came from his left. A skinny, twitchy man with a weasel's face had dismounted. This was Deputy Moss Tully, a man who lived in Pike's shadow and fed on his approval. Tully was poking at the ground near the water trough with the toe of his boot. What is it? Moss? Pike's voice was impatient. Looky here, Tully said. He bent down and picked something up from the dust. He held it up, dangling it from 2 fingers as if it were a dead snake. It was a small strip of linen, dark and stiff with dried blood. A piece of a bandage. Rowan's heart stopped. It must have fallen from Callan's wound when he drank. Pike's eyes snapped from the bandage to Rowan's face. His expression didn't change, but the coldness intensified, becoming a physical presence. His right hand, which had been resting on his thigh, moved. It settled, slowly, deliberately, on the worn of walnut grip of the pistol holstered on his hip. He didn't draw it. He just held it. A promise. A bandage. Rowan. Pike's voice was soft now, which was far more terrifying than his bark. Your sick calf wearing bandages, was it? The game was over. The lie was dead. The posse tensed, their hands moving to their own weapons. She was caught. She had maybe 2 seconds. Her eyes darted. The rifle was too far. The posse was between her and the house. Her mind catalogued her yard, the tools of her life, searching for a weapon, an escape, the trough, the corral, the chopping block, and the oil drum. It sat near the barn wall. A big 50-gallon drum of kerosene for the lamps and the tractor engine she was still saving for. Its spigot was near the bottom. It was a desperate, insane gamble. It was her only one. I don't know what that is, she said, her voice shaking just enough to sound like fear. Buying her a fraction of a second. As Pike took a step forward, his boot crunching on the gravel. Rowan moved. She didn't run from them. She ran at them, or rather, past them, toward the barn. Hey, Tully shouted, fumbling for his gun. But she was faster. In 3 strides, she reached the drum. She didn't try to open the top. She kicked the metal spigot sideways, hard, with the heel of her boot. The spigot snapped. A thick, clear stream of kerosene gushed out onto the dry, packed earth, spreading in a dark, fast-moving stain straight toward the line of horses. What in the Pike bellowed, finally drawing his pistol. Rowan was already moving. Her hand dived into her trousers pocket, pulling out the small tin of sulfur matches she always carried. She didn't break stride. She scraped one alive on the tin, the phosphorus flaring blue and yellow. She tossed it. The match hit the spreading pool of oil. The world exploded. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a whoomph, a deep, sudden roar as the fumes in the liquid caught at once. A wall of bright orange flame erupted from the ground, 6 feet high, cutting a line of fire directly in front of the horses. The heat was intense, a physical blow. The sudden light blinded everyone. The animals screamed. It was a sound of pure, primal terror. The horses, already skittish from the long ride, lost their minds. They reared, eyes rolling white, fighting the bits, screaming as the flames licked at their legs. The posse dissolved into chaos. My horse, whoa, whoa, damn you! Tully shrieked as his mount spun in a tight circle. Bucking. Another man was thrown, hitting the ground hard. Pike himself cursed. A string of oaths cut short as he fought to control his own terrified stallion, which was backing away, pulling him toward the gate. "Get him clear! Get him clear!" he roared. The yard was a mess of rearing horses, shouting men, and thick, choking black smoke. And in that brief, violent instant of chaos, a new sound cut through the noise. It came from behind the well. It was a whistle. It wasn't loud, but it was piercing and clear. A thin, reedy trill. 3 quick notes, then 2, then 1 long, low note. It sounded almost like a nightjar, but it wasn't. It was human. It was precise. It was a signal. Callan. He had used the cover of the fire to send a message. Rowan was the only one who seemed to hear it. Her head snapped toward the well, but she saw nothing but shadow and the flickering reflection of the fire. Who was he signaling? The fire was already dying down. The kerosene had burned off the hardpan. Having nothing else to catch, it had done its job. The men were regaining control, their voices hoarse with anger. Pike had his stallion mastered, but his face was a mask of fury, streaked with soot. He pointed his pistol not at Rowan, but at the ground by her feet. "That was a fool move. Hale, a fool move." "My hand slipped," Rowan said, breathing hard, her heart a drum. "The oil, it's slippery." Pike stared at her, the barrel of his pistol still smoking from the proximity to the flames. Though he hadn't fired, he knew she was lying. She knew he knew. "You think you're smart." He slowly, menacingly, holstered his weapon. He gathered his men, who were mounting up, their faces grim. "You listen to me, girl," Pike snarled, leaning over his saddle horn. "I don't know what you've got hidden in that barn, but we're tracking a killer. You hide that savage, you harbor him, and you're an accomplice. The penalty for that is a rope. You understand me? A rope." Rowan said nothing. She just stared back, her face hard. "We'll be back," Pike said, "at dawn, and we will have a federal warrant. We will tear this place apart, board by board. If he's here, we'll find him." He paused, letting the threat sink in. "And if he is, God help you." He wheeled his horse, a violent, angry motion. The posse followed, thundering out of her yard, a cloud of angry dust in their wake. But as Pike passed the main gatepost, he did something Rowan almost missed. His horse slowed for just a second. He reached out, his hand moving casually, as if brushing dust from the wood. But when he pulled his hand away, something remained. A small, white chalk mark, a circle with a cross inside. Rowan's blood turned to ice. That wasn't a sheriff's mark. That wasn't a legal sign. She'd seen it before, whispered about in town. It was the mark of the Carrick-Burr Syndicate. It meant target. Pike's threat of a warrant at dawn was a lie. The chalk mark was the truth. He wasn't coming back with the law. He was sending killers, and they would come long before the sun. The sound of the hoofbeats faded, leaving a silence that felt heavier and more dangerous than the noise. The yard stank of smoke and sulfur. Rowan didn't wait. She ran to the well. Callan had slumped, falling from his crouch onto his side. His eyes were half closed, his face pale and slick with a cold sweat. The effort of whistling, of staying silent through the confrontation, had taken everything he had left. "Callan?" she whispered, shaking his shoulder. "Callan, they're gone, but they're coming back." His eyes fluttered open. He tried to speak, but only a low groan escaped. "We have to move you." "Can you walk?" He tried to push himself up, his arms trembling, but he collapsed back, hissing in pain. The wound in his side, which had clotted, had torn open again. Fresh blood, dark in the twilight, was soaking his shirt. He was a dead weight, and she was alone. "All right," she said, to him, to herself. "All right." She grabbed his arm, pulling it over her shoulders, and hooked her own arm around his waist. "On 3, 1, 2, 3. With a grunt that tore from her own throat, she hauled him to his feet. He cried out, a muffled sound, and his entire weight fell on her. He was taller than her, and though lean, he was solid muscle. It was like trying to lift a felled tree. "Move your feet," she commanded, dragging him step by agonizing step. Her destination was the barn, but not the barn itself. Behind it, hidden by a stack of old hay bales, was a low, angled door, almost flush with the ground, the root cellar. She wrestled him through the barn, the smell of hay and manure thick in the air. She kicked the bales aside, grabbed the iron ring, and pulled. The heavy wooden door scraped open, revealing a set of steep, narrow stone steps leading down into blackness. The smell of damp earth, potatoes, and cool, still air rolled up to meet them. "This is going to hurt," she warned. She half carried, half dragged him down the steps, his boots thudding heavily on the stone. They tumbled onto the dirt floor at the bottom. She scrambled back up, pulled the heavy door shut, and dropped the thick wooden bar into place from the inside. They were plunged into absolute, tomb-like darkness. Rowan's breath was ragged. She fumbled in her pocket for the matches again. Her fingers were shaking. She struck one. The tiny flame illuminated a small, earthen-walled room, not 10 feet square. Shelves lined the walls, holding dusty jars of preserves, sacks of potatoes, and bundled herbs. She lit the lantern hanging from a low beam. The cold, steady oil light filled the space. Kalen was lying on the floor, his breathing shallow and fast. He was shivering, a deep, bone-rattling chill, even though the air in the cellar was mild. Rowan knelt beside him, the lantern in her hand. Now, for the first time, she truly saw the wound. She gently pulled the torn, bloody fabric away. It was worse than she'd thought. The close-range shot had torn through flesh and muscle, and the powder burns were a black, ugly scorch on his skin. It needed cleaning, it needed stitching, and it needed it now, or the fever already setting in would claim him before Pike's men ever could. He looked at her, his eyes clouded with pain but still sharp, still intelligent. Pike, Kalen whispered, his voice a dry rasp. "He's coming back," Rowan finished. "Or he's sending someone else, sooner than dawn." She looked at the wounded man, a stranger who had brought a war to her doorstep. She looked at the pouch in her hand, still unopened. She thought of the chalk mark, an X on her life. She could leave. She could bar the cellar from the outside, take Dust Finch, and ride for the high country. Leave him. Leave the ranch. Let Pike and his syndicate have this cursed patch of dirt. It was the smart choice, the safe choice. But then she thought of her father's words. "You don't deny water." She had given him water. She had started this. She looked down at Kalen, his life hanging by a thread. And she made the choice. She would not run. This was her land. That was her well. And this man, this messenger, was under her roof. She set the lantern down on a crate. "They won't find you," she said, her voice quiet, but hard as the stone around them. "I'm going to sew this wound. It's going to hurt, but you're going to live." She turned to her shelves, grabbing a jar of her mother's strongest herbal salve, a clean rag, and a tin box containing a spool of heavy thread and her sharpest suturing needle. She was making her stand. She was betting her life, her ranch, everything she had, on a wounded stranger and the contents of a leather pouch. The dawn, she knew, would come with a price paid in blood. She just had to decide who would be the one to pay it. The air in the root cellar was cold and heavy, thick with the smell of damp earth, stored apples, and the sharp, metallic tang of Kalen's blood. The single lantern cast harsh, dancing shadows that made the small space feel like a tomb. Rowan knelt on the dirt floor, the lantern beside her, and finally looked at the object that had brought this war to her door. It was a small, oiled leather pouch, stiff and tacky with Kalen's blood. Her fingers, still trembling slightly from the confrontation, fumbled with the wet tie. "He said Pike," Kalen whispered from the floor. He had dragged himself to sit against a wall of potato sacks, his face a pale, grim mask of pain. His breathing was a shallow, ragged rhythm. "He said you killed a federal officer," Rowan said, her voice flat. She pulled the contents free. It wasn't just a letter. It was a sheaf of folded papers, heavy linen stock, bearing the official eagle watermark of the United States War Department. She unfolded them carefully, her hands smudging the blood that was already on them. The lantern light illuminated rows of neat, spidery script. It was a shipping manifest, a list of cargo, designated by serial numbers. 4 dozen repeating rifles, model 1855 10 crates, ammunition, .58 caliber. Rowan's eyes scanned the page. The shipment was destined for Fort Yuma. An official Army requisition, but a second set of notes, in a different, hastier hand, was scrawled in the margins. Consignment diverted, she read aloud, her voice barely a whisper. May 14th, Mesquite Wash, unloaded under guard. She turned to the second page. It was a sworn affidavit, a statement of fact. It detailed how wagons, supposedly carrying mining equipment and agricultural tools for the Carrick-Burr Syndicate, were loaded with these exact, numbered weapons crates at Mesquite Wash, and at the bottom, above the official stamp of his office, was the signature. It was faint, blurred by what looked like water, or perhaps sweat, but it was legible. Ezra Voss, Deputy Federal Agent. Voss, Rowan breathed, looking at Callan. The man Pike said you. He was not my victim, Callan said, his voice raw. He was my partner. He shifted, and a low hiss of pain escaped his lips. Voss was a good man, an honest man. He saw the corruption in the territorial office. He saw the manifests being altered, the guns vanishing. Rowan looked back at the papers, her mind racing, connecting the pieces. Pike's immediate accusation, the close-range powder burn on Callan's side, the chalk mark. He was bringing this to the High Plateau Council. Callan continued, his voice strained. As proof of why the renegade attacks have grown so effective. The guns are coming from inside the territory, from the Syndicate. Carrick and Burr. Rowan said. She knew the name. Everyone did. They owned the biggest freighting company, the sluicing rights to the Silver Thread River, and half the politicians in the capital. Pike works for them. Pike is their dog. Callan spat, a flash of fire returning to his eyes. He provides the muscle. He makes the arrests, and he kills the witnesses. He and his men Tully, they were waiting for us at the wash. Voss gave me the papers. He told me to ride. He tried to hold them off. Callan's voice broke. Just for a moment. He died so this truth could be spoken. Rowan understood. Pike hadn't been hunting a killer. He had been finishing a job. He was hunting the evidence. And now she was holding it. But why? Rowan asked, the paper crinkling in her fist. Why would the Syndicate arm splinter groups? It's madness. It threatens everyone, even their own freight lines. Peace, Callan said, the word sounding like a curse. The elders of the High Plateau are 2 days' ride from signing a treaty, a real one. It defines the borders. It grants water rights at the Red Willow. It means the Army will pull back, and if the Army pulls back, the contracts dry up. Rowan finished, the cold, ugly logic settling on her like a shroud. The beef contracts, the grain, the freighting, the Syndicate lives on government gold. No war, no gold. He nodded. So they arm the few who don't want peace. They create chaos. The treaty fails. The war continues. The Syndicate profits, and Pike is just the start. Who, then? A man named Deacon Vale, Callan said. He is the Spider, the territorial court envoy. He never touches the dust. He never holds a gun. He sits in the Capitol, and he signs the papers. He's the one who provides the legal cover. When Voss filed his first report, it was Deacon Vale who marked it unfounded. It was Vale who signed the transfer order that sent Voss's loyal men to the border. He is the law, and he is the crime. Rowan fell silent. The weight of the cellar, the earth above her, felt immense. She was no longer a rancher protecting a wounded man. She was a witness to a conspiracy that reached from the governor's office to the grave of a federal agent. The choice was stark. If she handed Callan over to Pike at dawn, this evidence would disappear. Callan would be hanged as a killer, and Deacon Vale's plan would succeed. The gun running would continue. The war would escalate. But if she hit him, if she fought, the chalk mark on her gatepost was a death warrant. Pike and Vale would not, could not, let her live. Knowing what she now knew, they would burn her out. They would salt the earth. She looked around the small, dark room, at the shelves her mother had built, stocked with jars of peaches and beans, a life's work of preservation. She thought of her small herd of cattle, thirsty and waiting. She thought of her parents' graves, 2 simple wooden crosses on the bluff overlooking the ranch, the place called Kestrel Bluff. This was her land, bought with their sweat and their lives. She looked at Kalen, who was watching her, his dark eyes filled with pain, but also with a fierce, unwavering question. Her gaze fell on the neat, careful stitching of her mother's name on a sampler packed in a crate, and she thought of other mothers, the high plateau women, whose sons were dying from American rifles, sold by American greed, to fuel a fire that would consume them all. Her father's voice again. You don't deny water. Water was life. And these men, Pike, Vale, Carrick Burr, they were poisoning the well for everyone. The decision settled, hard and cold and final. We have to get this to your people, she said, her voice quiet but absolute. Kalen's head snapped up. The Red Willow Council, where the treaty is meant to be signed. My father traded with your people. He spoke of Chief Mato Gray Elk. He said he was a man of profound honor. He is, Kalen said, hope and disbelief warring in his voice. But it's a 2-day ride, across the ridge. I cannot. You will, Rowan said. She stood up, her body all business. I'll take you. We leave before dawn. We'll cross the Vermilion Ridge by the high pass. Pike will expect us to run south, to the flats. He won't look for us in the rocks. She looked down at his side. The makeshift bandage was soaked through, a dark, pulsing stain. But first, we have to keep you from bleeding out before sunrise. She turned to her supplies. This cellar was her fortress. She grabbed a wooden box from the top shelf. Inside was a bottle of whiskey, a tin of her strongest comfrey and yarrow salve, a spool of heavy-duty hemp thread, and a curved suturing needle, the kind she used for stitching up cattle or mending thick leather saddles. She tore a clean feed sack into strips for bandages. This, she said, kneeling beside him again, is going to be the worst part of your day. Kalen looked at the needle, then at her. He gave a grim, short nod. It is not the first. He braced himself against the potato sacks. Rowan uncorked the whiskey. She didn't offer him a drink. It was too precious. This is for the wound, she said, before he could brace himself. She poured a heavy splash of the raw spirits directly onto the raw, scorched wound. Kalen did not scream. A strangled, violent sound was torn from his throat, half hiss, half groan. His entire body went rigid, his knuckles turning white as he gripped his own legs. The smell of alcohol and blood filled the air. Bite this, she said, shoving a folded piece of canvas into his hand. He took it, pushing it between his teeth, and bit down, his jaw muscles knotting. Rowan threaded the needle with the hemp. Her hands were shaking. The sheer, brutal reality of what she was about to do hit her. She was not a doctor. She was a rancher. She closed her eyes for 1 second. She pictured her hands, numbed and cracked with cold, mending a torn harness in the middle of a blizzard last winter. Her fingers had been stiff, the leather frozen, but the stitch had held. Her hands were strong. They knew this work. She opened her eyes. The tremor was gone. Hold still, she commanded. She set the first stitch. The needle pierced the skin. Kalen's body jumped, a reflex of pure agony, but he made no sound beyond a choked gasp against the canvas. Rowan pulled the thread tight, closing the ragged edges. The work was slow, precise, and agonizing. Each pass of the needle made his muscles contract. Sweat poured from his forehead, glistening in the lantern light. His eyes were squeezed shut, and a low, continuous sound of pain hummed in his chest. She worked with a focused, detached calm. 1 stitch, tie the knot, wipe the blood. 2nd stitch, pull tight. The smell of his sweat, His blood, and the whiskey was overwhelming. She focused on the thread, on the mechanical motion, on the clean, tight line she was drawing to hold this man's life together. His eyes opened, finding hers. They were black, swimming with agony. But in their depths, she saw two things clearly: a profound, burning gratitude and a stark warning. They will show no mercy. When she finished, perhaps 20 minutes later, a raw, ugly seam held the wound closed. She smeared the thick, dark salve over the stitches and bound his side tightly with the clean feed sack strips. It was done. Kalen slumped, exhausted, the canvas falling from his slack jaw. He was breathing in shallow, shuddering gasps. "We can't be found with this," Rowan said, picking up the bloody, folded papers. "If they catch us, it dies with us." "The fire," Kalen whispered. "No, they'd smell the smoke, and it's the only proof." She looked at the papers, then at the cellar door. "I know a place. We have to go back outside, just for a minute. Can you move?" He nodded, a slow, pained gesture. She helped him to his feet. He leaned on her, his weight a heavy, solid burden. She unbarred the door, wincing at the scrape of the wood, and helped him up the steps. The night was dead silent. The yard, still smelling faintly of burnt kerosene, was empty. The stars looked cold and impossibly far away. The sliver of moon cast just enough light to see the pale dust. She half dragged him to the well, her well, the source of her life, and the start of all this. Near its base, set into the ground, was a heavy, flat flagstone her father had placed to cover an old, dry cistern pipe. It was always slightly loose. Rowan knelt, digging her fingers into the cracks. She grunted, pulling it up and sliding it aside, revealing a dark, hollow space about 2 feet deep. She placed the oilskin pouch containing the papers at the very bottom. "They won't look here," she whispered. She scraped a handful of ash and soot from the patch of earth where she'd thrown the match. She dipped her thumb in it and, on the underside of the flagstone, drew a simple 3-lined symbol, like a branching twig, a symbol for the Willow clan. She slid the heavy stone back into place. It settled with a soft, dusty thud. It was hidden. The truth was safe, buried at the heart of her ranch. She stood, her body aching with a new kind of tension, and turned to help Kalen. And she froze. A flicker of movement. Her eyes shot up, past the corral, past the barn, to the one place they shouldn't be, the roof of her house. For a fraction of a second, she saw him, a dark shape against the paler, star-dusted sky. A man, crouched low on the ridgepole of her sod roof. He was impossibly still, watching them, watching the well. Then, as if sensing her gaze, he melted backward into the darkness and was gone. Rowan's blood ran cold. That was not Sheriff Pike. That was not the clumsy, loud Moss Tully. That was a hunter, a professional. The chalk mark hadn't been a warning for dawn. It had been a beacon. Pike wasn't coming back. Deacon Vale had already sent someone better. They weren't waiting for morning. They were already here. The silence of the root cellar had become a suffocating weight. The man on the roof had not moved again, but his presence was a poison in the air. They couldn't stay below ground. If the house was set ablaze, the cellar would become their oven. "He's a spotter," Kalen whispered, his voice tight with pain as Rowan helped him up the steps and into the main room of the sod house. "He's not here to fight. He's here to watch, to aim." Rowan didn't reply. She moved with a cold, frantic energy, extinguishing the single lantern. The room was plunged into the thin, gray dark that comes an hour before dawn. She ran to the window, peering through a slit in the wooden shutters. The yard was still, empty. The chalk mark on her gatepost seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light. "They're waiting," she breathed. "They're waiting for it to be light enough to see, but dark enough to hide. They won't wait long," Kalen said. He had dragged himself to the far wall, near the fireplace, clutching the Winchester she had given him. His makeshift bandage was a dark, spreading stain. He was weakening, and fast. Then they saw it. A flicker of light from the east, near the corral. A second one from the north, By the barn. Lanterns, Rowan whispered, her stomach turning to ice. But they weren't stationary. They were moving, arcing through the air. One landed on the dry ground of the corral with a soft thud, the oil-soaked rag sputtering. Another sailed in a high, graceful arc, landing on the roof of the small feed shed. It wasn't a warning. It was an assault. "They're burning me out," Rowan said, her voice hollow. 4 of them. 4 men, moving like shadows, carrying fire. These weren't Pike's deputies. These were the Carrick Burr men, the professionals. Kalen raised the rifle, trying to aim through the window's slit, but his hands were shaking violently. "I can't hold it steady." "Don't," Rowan said. Her mind was racing, seizing on the only asset she had left. "Don't shoot. Not yet. A gunshot tells them exactly where we are." She ran to the back door, the one that opened toward the large holding pen where her main herd, 24 steers, stood huddled in the dark. Fire was the one thing they feared more than anything. "What are you doing?" Kalen hissed. "Creating a diversion," she said, her hand on the heavy iron bar. "My own fire." She slid the bar back. The sound was a loud, grating screech in the quiet. "Now." A man shouted from the yard, "Light the house! Burn 'em out!" Rowan kicked the gate open. At the same instant, she grabbed the burning kerosene-soaked rag from the corral, which had landed just feet away. With a desperate heave, she threw the burning brand into the herd. It landed on the back of a large steer. The animal bellowed, a sound of pure terror and pain, and lunged. It was all the herd needed. The sight of the flames, the smell of burning hair, the sudden, unbarred exit had triggered the stampede. The world dissolved into thunder. 24 steers, a solid wall of panic and muscle, burst from the pen, charging east, directly toward the men who were bringing the fire. "What in stampede?" Shouts turned to screams. Rowan saw one of the dark figures, the one by the barn, have to dive flat to avoid being trampled. The entire eastern side of her yard was a cloud of dust, bellowing and pounding hooves. The ground itself trembled. It was the opening she needed. But the other 2 men were undeterred. The roof get the roof. A new lantern, trailing flames, arced toward the house. It was a perfect throw, aimed at the dry, tinder-like thatch over the main room. "No!" Rowan screamed. But before the lantern could hit, a shot cracked from the porch. Crack. Kalen. He was lying on his stomach, braced on the porch planks. The Winchester pressed to his shoulder. The bullet shattered the lantern mid-air. It exploded in a spray of glass and burning oil, raining fire harmlessly onto the packed earth yards away. Another shot answered immediately. Whiz-thump the bullet. Fired from the man near the feed shed, slammed into the wooden trough just inches from Callan's head. Splinters flew, sparking like tiny, angry stars in the dark. Kalen cried out, rolling away, clutching his wounded side. The roof was safe, but the embers from the first lantern on the feed shed were catching. The dry wood was smoking. "Water!" Rowan yelled, more to herself than to him. She ran from the back door, staying low, using the house as cover. The large rain barrel at the corner of the house was her only hope. It was 3/4 full. She grabbed the metal bucket next to it, dipped, and hauled out a sloshing, heavy load. She sprinted the 10 yards to the shed, the air suddenly bright from the growing flames. She threw the water in a wide arc, aiming for the base of the fire. It hit with a loud, satisfying hiss. The flames died to a smoldering, angry smoke. She had saved the shed. "Rowan Hale!" The voice boomed from the front gate, cutting through the fading bellows of the cattle. It was Luther Pike. He was sitting on his horse, just outside the gate, as calm as a preacher on Sunday. He wasn't part of the attack. He was the audience. He had let his hired guns do the dirty work, and now he had arrived to claim the victory. The 4 gunmen, their faces hidden by shadow and bandanas, slowly emerged from the dust cloud, regrouping behind their employer. "The show's over, ma'am," Pike said, his voice cold. "My men were, overeager in their pursuit of the killer. Things got hot." He smiled. It was a terrible sight. You've got 10 seconds to hand him over. After that, my patience and my authority might just run out." He sat there, a black silhouette against the graying sky. 1. He counted. Rowan stood panting by the water barrel, the empty bucket in her hand. Kalen was trapped on the porch, his rifle empty. They were caught. 2. Kalen looked at her. His face was a mask of sweat and dirt. He knew he couldn't fight. He couldn't run. 3. He put his fingers to his lips. "What are you doing?" Rowan whispered, horrified. "He'll hear you." 4. "It's the only chance." Kalen rasped, and he whistled. It wasn't the short, sharp signal from the well. This was different. It was a long, mournful, rising call, a sound that seemed to pierce the sky itself. It was the cry of a hawk, but more. It was a plea, a summons, an arrow of sound shot into the vast, empty dawn. A call for anyone, any high-plateau warrior within a day's ride, who might be listening. 5. Pike's head tilted, as if he'd heard a mosquito. He sneered. "Whistling for your friends. They ain't comin', boy." 6. But the sound had covered another, smaller noise, a scrape. Rowan's head snapped toward the barn. The salt shed, the small lean-to where she cured hides, was just 20 feet away. The door was moving. 7. Someone was inside the barn, coming through the back. Pike's count was a distraction. They were flanking her. Rowan dropped the bucket and moved, silent as a shadow, her hand finding the cold, worn handle of the heavy skinning knife on her belt. 8. She pressed herself against the barn wall, next to the salt shed door. She could hear someone moving inside, clumsy in the dark, bumping against the stacked bags of salt. It was Moss Tully. He'd circled around during the stampede, come in through the back of the barn, and was now trying to get a clear shot at her from behind. 9. The salt shed door, which opened outward, creaked open. Tully's weasel face peered out, his pistol raised. He never saw her. Rowan grabbed the edge of the heavy wooden door with both hands and shoved. She put all her weight, all her fear, and all her rage into it. The door slammed into Tully's face and upper body with a sickening thud of wood on bone. He gave a high, choked yelp, his pistol firing uselessly into the dirt floor. He staggered back. Rowan was on him in an instant, not giving him time to recover. She burst into the shed, the 9-inch blade of her cattle knife gleaming in the dark. She put the point right under his chin, pressing it hard enough to sting. Tully froze, his eyes wide with terror, the smell of salt and his own sour fear filling the small space. "Drop it," she hissed. The pistol clattered from his limp fingers. 10. Pike boomed from the gate. "Time's up." At that exact moment, a different sound split the air. Not a shout, not a pistol. It was the flat, heavy crack of a high-powered rifle, fired from a long way off. It came from the ridge, from the spotter. Rowan was still half in, half out of the shed. She looked up, confused. The bullet wasn't for her. It was for Pike. No, it was for her. She saw the puff of dust on the porch post, an inch from her face. At the same instant, she was knocked off her feet. Kalen. He had thrown himself from the porch, a desperate, lunging tackle. He hit her hard, his solid weight driving her backward into the wall of the barn. The world spun. Thwack! The sound of the bullet striking was deafening. Rowan, her head ringing, looked up, where her chest had been a second before. There was now a deep, ragged hole in the thick cottonwood post of the porch. The bullet had passed clean through the space she had occupied. Kalen was slumped on top of her, his entire body shaking. "Kalen," she gasped. "Are you hit?" He didn't answer. He was just breathing. Great, ragged gasps of air. He had used his last ounce of strength to save her. And then the world went silent. Pike wasn't counting. Tully was whimpering in the shed. The hired guns were looking around, confused by the sniper shot. Into that silence came the reply. It was not a whistle. It was not a gunshot. It was a horn, faint but unmistakable, echoing off the high stone of the Vermilion Ridge, a deep, resonant, booming note, blown from a horn made of slate or shell. Ho, ho, it was an answer. Callan's head lifted from her shoulder. A bloody, grim smile split his face. They heard, he whispered. The effect on Pike's posse was immediate. The hired guns, who were paid to burn out a lone woman, were not paid to fight the High Plateau Nation. They looked at each other, then at the northern ridge, their confidence evaporating. Pike heard it, too. His face, which had been a mask of cold amusement, twisted into a knot of pure fury. The horn call had ruined his entire plan. "Sheriff?" one of the gunmen asked, his voice suddenly nervous. Pike stared at Rowan, who was slowly, carefully, pulling Callan off her. His eyes were full of venom. He had lost. For now. He pulled his horse's head around. "This ain't over. Hale," he spat. "This changes nothing. That was a call for war. You've brought war to this valley." He pointed a thick finger at her. "I'm pulling back, but I will be back with a legal warrant, a federal warrant, and I will have every deputy in this territory with me. You be ready." "When?" Rowan called out, her voice shaking but defiant. Pike smiled again, that terrible, cold smile. "High noon," he said. "Be ready to receive the law at high noon." He spurred his horse, and the entire group, Pike, his gunmen, and Moss Tully, who scrambled out of the shed and ran for his horse, thundered out of the yard, leaving Rowan Hale alone with her wounded savior, the smoldering ruins of her shed, and the echo of a horn call promising a war she did not ask for. There was no time for grief or gratitude. The echo of the horn was a promise. But Pike's threat of high noon was a deadline. Noon was less than 6 hours away. "He'll come sooner," Rowan said, dragging a whimpering Moss Tully from the salt shed and shoving him toward his horse. "Get on! Tell Pike his sniper missed! Tell him I'm waiting!" Tully, his nose clearly broken, scrambled into his saddle, not looking back. He galloped after the posse, a streak of panicked dust. "You're not waiting," Callan rasped from the porch. He was trying to stand, using the post for support. The post with the bullet hole. "No," she said. "We're not." She moved with the desperate, focused energy of a woman about to lose everything. The ranch was lost. The house was compromised. The well was now a liability. Her life was now whatever she could carry. She ran inside, grabbing a canvas satchel. Into it went her father's whetstone, a coil of wire, a small tin of matches, and the heavy, oiled steel jaws of a bear trap. It was a brutal, effective tool, and she knew how to set it. She added the last of her yarrow salve and a strip of clean linen. From the kitchen, she took a full water skin and a canvas bag, into which she stuffed a fistful of jerky and 3 hardtack biscuits. It was food for 2 days, if they were lucky. She ran to the barn. Ignoring the smoldering shed, Dust Finch, her mare, was still in her stall, eyes wide with terror from the stampede and gunfire. "Easy, girl," Rowan soothed, her voice low and steady as she threw the saddle blanket and saddle onto the horse's back. She worked quickly, her hands sure, cinching the straps tight. This horse was their only legs. Getting Callan on was the hardest part. He had dragged himself to the barn, but his strength was gone. The effort of throwing himself at Rowan had torn the new stitches. A fresh, dark stain was spreading across the white bandage. "I can't pull myself up," he breathed, his hand gripping the pommel, his body shaking. "Don't pull," Rowan commanded. She put her shoulder under his armpit, wrapped her arm around his waist, and took his good hand. "On 3, I lift, you jump. 1, 2, 3, he cried out, a sharp, choked sound as all his weight landed on his wounded side, but she shoved, and he scrambled, falling more than climbing into the saddle. He slumped forward, gripping the pommel with both hands, his head hanging. "Hold on," she said, tying the satchel and water skin to the saddle horn. "Just hold on." She grabbed the reins, gave one last look at the sod house built by her father, at the well, at the graves on the bluff. She was turning her back on her life. She led the horse out, not through the gate, but through the broken fence of the corral, heading west, away from the trail Pike had taken. "Where?" she asked, walking fast, her hand on the horse's neck. "Arroyo del Lobo," Kalen managed to say, his voice thick. "It's a dry wash, 2 miles southwest. It cuts toward the ridge. It'll hide our tracks." She knew the place, a jagged scar in the earth, its bed thick with loose sand and gravel. They reached it in 20 minutes, a grueling walk for her, an agony for him. The sun was a hot white disk, climbing the sky. It was perhaps 7 in the morning, 5 hours to noon. The arroyo was a good choice. Its high, crumbling walls of red dirt and stone would hide them from a distance, and the sandy bottom would leave few tracks, which the wind would soon erase. But it was slow going. She had to lead Dust Finch carefully over rock falls and around thickets of thorny mesquite. The horse stumbled, and Kalen nearly fell, catching himself with a groan that tore at Rowan's heart. "Just a little further," she urged, though she didn't know what further meant. The arroyo twisted, climbing steadily toward the high country. The walls grew steeper, the passage narrower. They were in a canyon now, a natural funnel. "Stop!" Kalen's voice was sharp, a sliver of his old strength returning. "What?" She froze, scanning the rocks. "Up there." He nodded with his head, too weak to lift a hand. "The pass! Look!" Rowan squinted, following his gaze. High above them, where the arroyo narrowed to a tight, V-shaped pass, the sun glinted off something. It was not rock, it was metal, a rifle barrel. The sniper, the man from her roof. He had anticipated their route, or Pike had sent him. He was waiting for them, holding the high ground, the sun at his back. He had the only way out of the arroyo bracketed. "Hawk-eyed Rourke," Kalen whispered, his voice full of a sudden, cold dread. "I heard Vale had a man, an ex-army sharpshooter. He never misses." They were trapped. They couldn't go back. Pike was behind them. They couldn't go forward. Rourke was in front. Rowan's mind raced. The sun. The glint. Rourke was using the sun to hide himself. "Your pouch," she said to Kalen. "The one I gave back to you." "What?" "Your medicine pouch, on your belt. Does it have anything shiny?" He fumbled, his fingers weak. He pulled it from his belt. "A piece of shell. My mother's." "No, I need—" Her eyes scanned her own gear. "Nothing. Wait, in the small medical pouch she had packed, among the bandages, was her mother's sewing kit. And inside that, she tore the satchel from the saddle horn, her hands frantic. She ripped open the small kit. There, a tiny, silver-backed mirror, no bigger than a $1 coin that her mother had used for plucking eyebrows. "Hold the horse," she said. She scrambled up the loose scree of the arroyo wall, climbing 10, then 20 feet, until she was perched precariously on a ledge. Hidden from Rourke by an outcrop of rock, she held the mirror in her palm. The sun was hot on her back. She angled the tiny piece of glass, catching the morning light. A brilliant, blinding white circle, no bigger than her hand, flashed onto the canyon wall opposite her. She moved her hand, walking the circle of light up the wall, up, toward the pass. "What?" Kalen breathed from below. "He's using the sun," she said, her voice tight with concentration. "So will I." She found the spot, the tiny glint of the rifle barrel. She aimed her own small sun at it. The brilliant white circle danced, then steadied, landing directly on the sniper's nest. She couldn't see Rourke, but she knew he could see nothing at all. He was staring directly into a focused beam of the high desert sun. "Now!" she yelled to Kalen. "Move!" She kept her hand steady, the mirror burning hot. The beam of light a lance of pure white fire aimed at the sniper. Below, she heard Dust Finch's hooves scrambling on the rock. Kalen urging the horse on with a low, pained shout. A shot cracked the air, echoing like a cannon in the narrow space. Crack-ping, the bullet went wild, striking the canyon wall 50 feet to their left. He was shooting blind. "Go, go!" Rowan screamed. Another shot, just as wild. Crack ricochet Kalen and the horse disappeared around the bend, through the pass, and out of the line of fire. Rowan didn't wait. She slid down the scree, her boots filling with gravel, and ran. She rounded the bend, her lungs burning. just as a third shot hit the rock she had been hiding behind. She was through. They were clear. Kalin had stopped the horse 100 yards later, slumped over, shaking. "He won't follow," Kalin panted. "His job is to hold the pass, not to chase." "We have to keep moving," Rowan said, taking the reins again. They were in the high country now, a broken land of juniper and towering rock spires. The air was thinner, cooler. Kalin raised a shaky hand. "There, that spire." He pointed to a tall, needle-like tower of red rock. "That is a signal place, a marker for the Willow clan. If you could," he fumbled in his hair, pulling a small, downy feather, gray and white, from the tie. "A young hawk's feather. It means a messenger is in peril." Rowan looked at the spire. It was a quarter-mile off their path. "We don't have time. They will find it," he insisted. "The horn they are coming. This will guide them." Rowan cursed under her breath. It was a gamble. But the horn had been an answer. "All right." She ran, leaving him with the horse. The ground was hard, rocky. She reached the base of the spire, found a crack in the rock at eye level, and wedged the small, soft feather into it, a tiny, fragile sign against an ocean of stone. She ran back, her breath ragged. As she neared the horse, she stopped. A shadow passed over her. Then another. She looked up. High overhead, perhaps a dozen of them, were buzzards, vultures. They were circling, not randomly, but in a tight, patient vortex. "Oh, no," she whispered. They weren't circling her. They were circling something just ahead, in a small clearing off the trail. "Kalin," she said, her voice low. He had seen them too. "They mark the end of things," he whispered. Rowan led the horse forward, her skin crawling. The smell hit her first, the thick, sweet, awful smell of death, already ripening in the morning sun. In the center of the clearing, lying beside an overturned horse, was a man. He was white, dressed in a dark suit, now torn and black with dried blood. His chest was a ruin, a pulpy, dark red mass. But he wasn't dead. His head turned as they approached. His eyes, clouded with pain, found them. "Voss!" Kalin breathed, sliding from the horse, heedless of his own pain. He stumbled to the man's side. Rowan ran after him. She saw it now. Pinned to the man's ruined vest was a small, silver badge, a federal agent. Voss Ezra Kalin knelt beside him. "Kalin," the man whispered. The sound was a wet rattle. "You made it." "Pike," Voss coughed, a spray of blood on his lips. "He didn't check. He thought I was finished." "We'll help you," Rowan said, kneeling, reaching for her waterskin. "No," Voss said, his eyes finding hers. "No time. You." "Who?" "Rowan Hale. A friend. Listen." His voice was failing. He was drowning from the inside. "He veiled the spider. He's greedy. Not just guns." He fumbled at his own shirt pocket. His fingers were weak, slick. "Bribes. He took bribes. From everyone. Mining, freight, even the beef contracts. He wrote it all down." "Wrote it where?" Rowan pressed, leaning closer. "The ledger is private ledger. At Station House 9 in Copper Bend." Station House 9. Rowan knew it. It was the main freight depot for Carrick Burr. "His safe," Voss gasped. "He thinks he's smart. Hides it in the open. The safe." His body arched in a sudden, violent spasm. His eyes rolled back. "Ezra!" Kalin grabbed his shoulder. Voss's eyes focused one last time, with terrible, burning clarity, on Rowan. His hand shot out, grabbing her wrist. His grip was like iron. "My pocket," he rasped. Rowan reached into his vest pocket. Her fingers touched a single, cold piece of metal. A key. A small, ornate, brass key. "The safe," Voss whispered. He pulled her closer, his face inches from hers. "Stop him! For my—" His breath went out in a long, final sigh. The grip on her wrist relaxed. His head fell back, his eyes open and glassy, staring at the buzzards circling above. He was gone. Kalin bowed his head, his shoulders shaking. Rowan stood. the small brass key heavy in her hand, the key to Deacon Vale's safe. She looked at the dead man. A federal officer murdered by a sheriff. She gently untied the silk neckerchief from around his throat. It was dark blue, embroidered with a single, elegant letter E. She folded it and put it in her pocket with the key. Evidence. Rowan. Callan's voice was flat. Dead. He was pointing, not at Voss, but back the way they had come, back toward the arroyo. A cloud of dust, a large one, moving fast. Pike, she breathed. The sniper. Rourke. He hadn't just been holding the pass. He had been signaling. He had told Pike which way they'd run. The posse was maybe 20 minutes behind them. They were on a fresh trail, and they were riding hard. "Get on the horse," Rowan said, her voice hard, pulling Callan to his feet. "We can't outrun them," he panted, his wound leaking, his face pale as ash. "Not with my weight." "Get on the horse." She shoved him into the saddle. She didn't mount. She grabbed the reins and ran, pulling Dust Finch into a jarring trot. But Pike's men were gaining. The sound of their hoofbeats was a low, steady thunder, growing louder. Rowan looked around. Frantic. The terrain was open, rocky, nowhere to hide. Then she saw it. A deep, dry creek bed. A tributary of the Lobo. Cutting sharply to the left, its bottom was thick with fallen branches and dead scrub. "Hold on," she yelled. She didn't lead the horse into it. She led it alongside it, on the hard, rocky bank where the tracks were faintest. "He's fading. Rowan," Callan mumbled. He was swaying dangerously in the saddle. "Just hold on." They reached a thicket of dead willows. She stopped. She pulled her skinning knife, in a flurry of motion. She cut 2 long, sturdy poles and a dozen shorter cross branches. "What?" "They're following our tracks," she said, her hands flying, lashing the branches together with the wire from her pack. "We have to erase them." She created a crude travois, a simple A-frame drag. She lashed it to the back of the saddle. "Now," she said. She led Dust Finch down the steep bank, into the sandy bed of the creek. The travois, the heavy drag of branches, fell behind the horse, and as they moved, it wiped away their tracks completely. It left only a wide, messy smear, like a rock slide or a bundle of tumbleweeds had blown through. They moved down the creek bed for half a mile, the high, crumbling walls hiding them, the branch drag erasing their path. "We have to stop," Callan whispered. He was sliding. "I can't." He was about to fall. His skin was cold, clammy. The fever was setting in, and the loss of blood was too much. Rowan looked up. The creek wall here was sheer stone, black and glistening with salt, an old salt seep, and there, hidden behind a curtain of dry, dead vines, was a dark slit in the rock. It wasn't a cave. It was a crack, a fissure, no wider than a man's shoulders. "There," she said. She cut the travois free, letting it lie in the creek bed. She pulled Callan from the saddle. He collapsed against her, a dead weight. She led Dust Finch into a dense thicket of tamarisks, hoping the horse would be hidden. Then she dragged Callan to the crack. "I can't fit," he panted, looking at the narrow opening. "Yes, you can. Sideways. Go!" She pushed him. He grunted in pain, turning his shoulders, and slid into the blackness. Rowan followed, pulling her satchel after her. The entrance was a tight, scraping squeeze, barely a foot wide and 10 feet long. Then it opened up. They fell into a small, dark chamber, its walls glittering with salt crystals in the thin light from the entrance. The air was cool, dry, and dead. Rowan crawled to the entrance, peering out. She could hear them now. The posse, shouting. "They came this way, the tracks." "Where'd they go? They just stop." "Spread out, find where they climbed the bank. They can't have vanished." Rowan pressed herself back into the darkness. She could hear Pike's voice, cursing. They were just outside, maybe 100 yards away. She turned to Callan. He was lying on the salt-dusted floor, his eyes closed. His breathing was shallow, a faint, fluttering sound. He was shivering, despite the mild air. They were hidden. They were safe, for the moment. But as she looked at Callan, his life draining away onto the salty floor. She knew that Pike wasn't her only enemy. Time was, and it was running out. The sounds of the posse faded. Rowan waited, pressed against the cold, gritty salt wall, her body rigid, her breathing held. She counted to 500, her heart hammering a slow, painful rhythm against her ribs. The fissure they had slipped through was a narrow, gray slit of light, revealing nothing but the opposite wall of the dry creek bed. Nothing. No returning hoofbeats, no shouts, just the vast, empty silence of the high desert. They were gone. For now. She let out the breath she'd been holding. It came out as a ragged shudder. "They're gone," she whispered into the darkness. There was no reply. "Callan," only the faint, alarmingly shallow sound of his breathing. She fumbled in her satchel, her fingers finding the small tin of matches and the tiny, shielded lantern she'd packed. She couldn't risk a fire, but she had to see. Her hands were shaking, not from fear, but from the bone-deep cold of the cave and the adrenaline crash. She struck a match. The tiny flame flared, and she lit the lantern's wick, turning it down to the lowest possible glow. The light illuminated their tiny prison. It was a small, natural chamber, the walls weeping salt, which glittered like a million tiny, trapped stars. Callan was lying where she had dragged him. His face was the color of pale ash, streaked with sweat and grime. His eyes were closed, his lips drawn back from his teeth in a mask of pain. The makeshift bandage she had applied at the ranch was completely soaked. The stitching had held, but the sheer exertion, the fall from the horse, and the tackle to save her had taken a terrible toll. He was shivering, a deep, violent, uncontrollable shudder that rattled his entire frame. It was the chill of shock and severe blood loss. It was the chill that came before the end. "No," she whispered, a fierce, protective anger rising in her. "You don't, not after all this." She ripped a strip from the last of her clean linen, uncapped her waterskin, and dampened the cloth. The water was lukewarm, but it was all she had. She knelt beside him, her shadow huge and dancing on the glittering walls. Her hand, calloused and steady from roping cattle and mending fences, was trembling now as she gently, so gently, wiped the dirt and dried blood from his face. She brushed the matted hair back from his forehead. His skin was impossibly cold, yet damp with a feverish sweat. "Callan," she said, her voice low, "stay with me. Talk to me." His eyelids fluttered, opening to narrow slits. His eyes, usually so sharp and black, were clouded, struggling to focus. "So cold," he whispered, his teeth chattering. I know." She had no blankets. The lantern gave off no warmth. She sat beside him, lost, the sounds of his shivering echoing in the small, dead space. Tell me about your home," she urged, desperate to anchor him, to keep his mind from slipping away. "The Red Willow Council. Tell me what it's like." It took him a long moment. He breathed, a shallow, hitching sound. "Not like this," he said, his gaze drifting over the salt-crusted walls. "It is open. The water, the spring it runs clear, so clear you can count the stones at the bottom." He paused, gathering strength. "My father, he made me promise, as a boy, the sun, Dan, as it teaches you that what we take, we must honor. Keep the spring clean. He told me, it is the mouth of the world. If it is poisoned, we all die." He looked at her, his eyes gaining a fraction of their lost focus. "You understood. At the well. Why?" Rowan felt a strange tightness in her throat. She sat back on her heels, the damp cloth in her hand, the little lantern flame reflected in her eyes. "My mother," she said, her voice quiet. "She was a widow for a long time before she passed. This land, it was hard on her, but she was kind. Kinder than this place deserved. People would come, trailing herds, their wagons low on water. My father's well was the only sure thing. I was a girl. I told her she should charge them. Charge them $1 a barrel. We were poor. It was good business." She looked down at her own hands, at the calluses and scars. "She took me to the well. Rowan continued, her voice a near whisper. She made me look down into the dark. You see that, she said. That water doesn't belong to us. Rowan, it belongs to the thirst. It belongs to the deer and the hawk and the man whose tongue is swollen with dust. God didn't put it there for us to sell. He put it there for us to share. She said water belongs to every living thing. You don't own it. You just get to be its guardian. She looked back at Kaelin. I guess I'm just my mother's daughter. A faint, pained smile touched his lips. She was a chief in her own. His words were cut off as a violent, shuddering wave of cold seized him. It was worse this time. His back arched, and a low sound of pure misery tore from his throat. Callan. He was losing the fight. The cold was winning. She didn't think. She acted. She was a rancher. She knew how to save a newborn calf from a blizzard. You shared your warmth. It was the only way. She set the lantern aside, and in the dim, glittering dark, she lay down on the cold salt floor beside him. She was clumsy, driven by a desperate, practical need. She pressed her body against his, from shoulder to knee. He was so cold. His skin, even through his clothes and hers, felt like ice. What? He gasped, his body rigid, not just from cold, but from the shock of her closeness. Be still, she commanded, her voice rough. You're freezing to death. I'm the only warmth here. Now be still. She pulled his arm, moving his body until they were pressed tightly together. A desperate huddle against the all-consuming cold. It was awkward and intimate, and had no place for shame. She shifted, trying to share as much warmth as possible. She brought her other arm up, laying it across his chest, her hand on his far shoulder, pulling him in. Her face was inches from his. She could feel his shivering. It was a fine, terrible vibration that passed from his body into hers. Just breathe, she murmured, her own voice unsteady. Feel the warmth. Take it. She pressed her forehead against his temple. His skin was like cold, damp stone. Her own warmth felt small against the tide of his chill, shoulder to shoulder, hip to hip. She could feel the shallow, ragged hitch of his breathing. It was too fast, too shallow. Breathe with me, she whispered. A command. Slow. In. She took a deep, slow breath, holding it, letting the heat build in her own chest. And out. He tried. His breath came out as a shudder. Again. In. She breathed, and he tried to follow. His body, his entire being was focused on two things, her warmth and the rhythm of her breathing. The shivering did not stop, but the violence of it began to ebb. The terrible, rattling shudders smoothed out into a deep, steady tremor. The tiny oil lamp flickered. Its light was just enough to paint the sharp line of his cheekbone, the dark sweep of his eyelashes, the grit on his skin. He smelled of horse and dust, and the sharp, metallic scent of his own blood. But beneath it all, he smelled like a man. His breathing was still unsteady, but it was deeper. He was no longer fighting her. He was sinking into her warmth. A lifeline. His hand, which had been lying cold and limp, moved. It was a slow, agonizingly weak motion. His fingers found her hand, the one she had braced on the ground. He didn't have the strength to clasp it. His fingers just rested against hers. It was the first time they had touched not in violence, or in desperation, or in medical need. His head turned, a fractional movement on the dusty floor. His forehead was no longer against her temple, but against her own. His eyes, dark and deep and now shockingly clear, were looking directly into hers. They were so close. The entire world had shrunk to the space of a single breath. The posse, the ledger, the war, it was all outside. In here, there was only the cold salt, the tiny lamp, and the shared air between them. He was not shivering. He was just looking at her. And in his eyes, she saw her own reflection, and something else, a shared understanding that was deeper than any words they had spoken. She didn't know who moved first. Perhaps neither of them. Perhaps it was just the last, inevitable inch of space closing. Her lips touched his. It was not a kiss of passion. It was a kiss of profound, desperate, and trembling fact. It was the simplest, most elemental confirmation. We are here. We are alive. His lips were chapped, cold, and tasted of salt and dust. Her own were trembling. It was a fragile, fleeting touch, a spark of life in the absolute dark, a defiant gesture against the death that waited for them both. It lasted only a second, 2, but it was a lifetime. When they parted, the air between them was electric. Rowan did not pull away. She kept her forehead pressed to his. "Listen to me," she whispered, her voice a low, fierce promise in the dark. "If you live and you will live, I will get you to your council. I will get that evidence to your people. I swear it." She closed her eyes, her breath warm on his face. "And if I fall, if they find me, you remember this. You remember I chose the water. You remember I didn't choose to be afraid." His hand moved again, the one resting against hers, with a slow, deliberate effort that seemed to take all his remaining strength. He lifted his hand and turned hers over, his fingers tracing the hard, raised lines of her palm. He touched the calluses at the base of her fingers, the ones from the spade, the rope, the axe. It was a language all its own. He, a warrior, was touching the source of her strength. It was not a caress. It was a gesture of profound respect, a salute, from one survivor to another. "I see you. I know what you are." A different kind of warmth was spreading through her, one that had nothing to do with saving him from the cold. It was deep and slow, and it settled in her chest like hot coals. "Rowan," he whispered, the first time he had said her name. "I know," she said. He was too weak to move, and she was too spent. The immediate crisis was over. The shivering had stopped. His breathing was slow, regular. He was asleep or unconscious. She wasn't sure, but he was warm. She could not stay like that, holding him. She, too, needed to rest. Noon was coming, gently, carefully. She extracted herself from him. The cold of the cave floor hit her instantly. She turned, settling her back against his, a solid line of warmth. They were back to back, like two soldiers in a trench, guarding each other's blind side, sharing a single small patch of life in a hostile world. Rowan Hale closed her eyes. The feeling did not fade. It was not a fire. It was an ember, banked deep, shielded from the wind, and ready to burn when the time came. She fell into an exhausted, dreamless sleep, her back pressed against his. The salt-walled cave, their first and only refuge. When she woke, the light had changed. The gray slit of the entrance was no longer gray. It was a harsh, bright white. It was late morning. She sat up, her body stiff and cold. She turned. Kalen was awake. He was sitting up, his back against the wall. The color had not returned to his face, and the wound in his side was a map of agony. But his eyes were perfectly clear. The fever had broken. He looked at her, and the night, the confession, the cold, the kiss, the shared warmth, it was all there in his gaze. It was a bond, forged and finalized, not in words, but in blood and water, and a shared oath in the dark. He gave a slow, single nod. "I remember." She nodded back. "I remember, too." Rowan stood up, her muscles screaming. She picked up her satchel. The girl who had given a stranger water at a well was gone. The woman who stood now was a partner in a war. "Station House 9, she said, "in Copper Bend." "It's impossible," Kalen said, his voice a dry rasp. "It's Vale's fortress." "So was this ranch," Rowan said, checking the small key Voss had given her. "Pike gave us till noon. We're late." Copper Bend was a town choking on its own dust. It was noon, and the heat was a physical weight, pressing down on the muddy main street, the clapboard storefronts, and the massive, sprawling freight depot of Station House 9. The air was thick with the smell of coal smoke, manure, and the sharp tang of the nearby smelter. Rowan had traded her canvas trousers for a life. On the trail, they had found Dust Finch, wandering but unharmed. in Agent Voss's saddlebags. They'd found his contingency a spare, dark wool suit, a small pouch of coins, and a letter addressed to a boarding house, introducing his sister, a grieving widow just arrived from the East. She had walked into that boarding house as Rowan Hale, a wanted fugitive. She walked out an hour later as Mrs. Amelia Cole, a woman invisible in her grief. She wore a high-necked black dress, heavy wool despite the heat, and a dark veil that obscured her features, turning her face into a smudge of shadow. The disguise was suffocating, but it was a perfect armor. Kalen was the harder part. His wound was a fiery torment, the stitches pulling, the bandage a dark map of his suffering. But he was alive, his eyes clear and hard as obsidian. He couldn't be a gentleman. He had to be baggage. He used the last of Voss's coins to buy a set of filthy denim overalls and a greasy canvas cap from a drunkard behind the saloon. He smeared axle grease from a wagon wheel onto his face, hiding his strong, native features under a mask of common labor. They did not approach Station House 9 together. Mrs. Amelia Cole, the widow, walked with a pained, dignified stiffness, clutching a small reticule. Callan, the porter, shuffled 50 feet behind her, his shoulders slumped, carrying her single, battered valise, a valise that now contained a loaded pistol, the bear trap, and Voss's neckerchief. "I am here to see about my late husband's shipment," Rowan announced, her voice adopting a clipped Eastern accent, brittle with feigned grief. The main depot office was chaos. Men yelled shipping numbers, telegram keys clattered, and the air was blue with cigar smoke. A harried clerk, his sleeves held up by green garters, barely looked at her. "Mr. Vale's office is in the back, ma'am, but he ain't here." "He is expecting me," Rowan insisted, her voice rising just enough. "A telegram was sent. He's expected at noon, ma'am, for the eastbound train. You can wait in the private parlor. He'll be here any minute." The clerk pointed. "And my man," she gestured dismissively toward Kalen, who stood shuffling by the door, the picture of weary insignificance. "He waits in the hall. Porters don't come in. Very well." As Rowan swept past the main desks, she saw him, hawk-eyed Rourke. He was leaning against a filing cabinet, not in his sniper's gear, but in a simple shirt and trousers. He was cleaning his fingernails with a long, sharp knife. He was Vale's shadow, the gatekeeper. He glanced at Rowan, his eyes lingering for a second, then dismissed her. She was just another woman, wrapped in black, but Kalen, he did watch. He clocked every porter, every laborer. Kalen kept his head down, staring at the floor, the cap pulled low. Rowan knew she had to get that fingerprint. She turned, as if a thought had struck her. "Clerk, I must have a receipt for my baggage." "Ma'am, we ain't—" "My husband," she snapped, her voice breaking just right, "insisted on receipts. For everything." The clerk sighed, rolling his eyes. He grabbed a blank freight receipt from a stack on the desk nearest Rourke and dipped a pen in a small, open inkwell. Rowan moved. She stumbled, her black skirts catching. Her hand flew out, striking the desk, and the small, heavy inkwell toppled, spilling a perfect black pool across the polished wood, right toward Rourke. "Oh," she cried. "My clumsiness! Oh, forgive me!" Rourke cursed, jumping back. "Damn it, woman!" Here, let me—" The clerk grabbed a rag. But Rourke, his instincts moving faster, slapped his hand down on the nearest clean or dry object to stop the ink from ruining other manifests. He pressed his palm flat on the blank freight receipt. "Just get out of the way," he snarled, lifting his hand. Rowan saw it, a perfect, glistening black thumbprint, pressed into the cheap paper. "Oh, I'm so sorry, sir," Rowan said, retrieving the ruined receipt from him, dabbing at the ink. "Let me dispose of this for you. I am just so overwrought." She folded the paper, the wet ink on the inside, and tucked it into her reticule. Rourke, disgusted, was busy wiping the ink from his hand. He didn't give the paper a second thought. She had it. She disappeared into the private parlor, a small, stuffy room with velvet chairs. She waited 30 seconds, her heart pounding. She heard the clerk return to his yelling. She slipped the lock on her door. Then she crossed to the second door, the one connecting to Vale's office. It was locked, as she'd expected, but she had a key. She pulled the heavy, ornate brass key from her dress. It wasn't Agent Voss's key. It was her key, the key to her own father's roll-top desk. But she had spent 10 minutes in the dirt of the stable yard, filing its teeth against a rough stone, changing its shape. It was a gamble. She slid the filed key into the lock. It jammed. She held her breath, jiggled it, pulled it back a fraction, and turned. A soft, oily click. The door opened. She was in. Vale's office was silent, dark, and plush. A thick carpet muffled her steps. A large, mahogany desk sat in the center, behind a painting of a steam engine. As she'd guessed, was the safe. It was a modern combination lock. She looked at the desk. Too complex, too slow. She ran her fingers along the desk. Vale was a man of arrogance. He wouldn't hide his secrets. He would lock them. The center drawer, locked. She tried the filed key again. It was rough, but it caught. She turned. The lock sprung. Inside, lying on top of ledgers and contracts, was a small, leather-bound diary. His private diary. She opened it. July 10th. Pike, $500. Services rendered Voss. July 12th. Rourke, $50. Retainer Hale Ranch. And on the back page, written in a clear, smug hand combination. My birth year, 1821. Her hands flew to the dial. 18, left, 21, right. The handle turned. The heavy iron door swung open with a well-oiled sigh. It was there. A single, massive, leather-bound book. The real ledger. She pulled it out. It was heavy. She opened it. Page after page of black ink on pale green paper. Names, dates, shipments. Pike, L, $500. Vale, D, $1,000. And then she found it. A separate section. Shipping codes. Item 44B agricultural tools. Mesquite wash cross-referenced to cargo. 77A US. Army property. Springfield rifles. Crate 12. It was all here. The entire conspiracy. The town bell began to toll. Bong. 1. Bong. 2. Rowan froze. Noon. Bong. 3. She clutched the heavy ledger to her chest. She had to get out. Heavy. Confident bootsteps stopped outside the other door. The door to the main hall. The knob turned. The door swung open. Deacon Vale stood there. He was not a frontier ruffian like Pike. He was pale, impeccably dressed in a gray Eastern suit, a silk vest, and a gold watch chain. He smelled of bay rum and expensive cigars. He looked at the disheveled widow. He looked at the open safe. He looked at the ledger in her hands. He did not shout. He simply smiled. An impressive performance, ma'am, he said, his voice smooth as oiled steel. But you've missed your curtain call, Mrs. Voss, I presume, or given the state of your hands, Miss Rowan Hale, I'm afraid my associates found your ranch lacking in hospitality. He took a step in. Rourke in here. Rowan didn't run for the door he'd entered. She ran for the wall. Rourke, Vale shouted again, lunging for her. Rowan grabbed the thick, braided cord hanging by the window and yanked it down with all her weight. A deafening, shattering shriek tore the air. The depot's steam whistle, a sound that could be heard for a mile, screamed, a signal of pure, industrial panic. Outside in the depot, all motion stopped. Clerks looked up. Loaders froze. Callan, sitting on a baggage trolley, knew the signal. He vaulted to his feet, grabbing the side of a massive, overloaded freight cart piled high with heavy crates. Make way, he roared, and shoved it with his good shoulder. The cart, weighing half a ton, rumbled forward, gaining speed, and crashed directly into the two guards who were running toward Vale's office. The men disappeared under an avalanche of splintered wood and scattered cargo. In the office, Vale grabbed Rowan's arm. You! She didn't fight him. She ducked, twisting, bringing the heavy ledger up, smashing it into his knee. He howled, his grip loosening, and stumbled back. Rowan didn't wait. She kicked the ornate wooden panel under his desk. It burst open, revealing a square of blackness, the coal chute. She clutched the ledger and dove headfirst into the dark, sliding down a 30-foot shaft of rough metal, landing hard on a pile of coal dust in the furnace room. She was black with soot, choking. A hand grabbed her. "This way, Callan." He had come down the service stairs, his face a grim mask of black grease and pale skin. He kicked open the heavy furnace room door, and they burst out into the back alley. A cold sheet of rain hit them. A sudden, violent noon shower. The alley was slick with mud and refuse. Freedom was 50 feet away. Going somewhere. Hawk-eyed Rourke stepped out from behind a stack of water barrels, blocking their path. He wasn't holding his rifle. He was just standing there, that terrible long-bladed knife in his hand, blocking the narrow alley. "Vale wants the book, ma'am," Rourke said, his voice almost gentle. "He wants you alive. He didn't say anything about him." He nodded at Callan. He lunged, not at Rowan, but at Callan, the knife aimed at his wounded side. Rowan screamed, but Callan didn't flinch back. He stepped into the attack, his good arm coming up, catching Rourke's wrist. The force of the lunge drove them both back, but Callan held the knife hand, his muscles straining. Rowan looked around, frantic, a pile of firewood for the furnace. She grabbed a thick, heavy piece of split oak. Rourke, realizing his mistake, slammed his boot into Callan's wounded side. Callan roared in agony, his grip failing. As the knife came free, Rowan swung the heavy club. She didn't aim for his head. She aimed for his hand. The oak connected with Rourke's wrist with a flat, wet crack. Rourke shrieked, a high, thin sound, and the knife clattered onto the cobblestones. Callan, despite the pain, drove his shoulder into Rourke's chest, slamming him back against the brick wall. Rourke slid down, clutching his broken, useless hand, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Callan snatched up the fallen knife. He raised it, his face a mask of pure, vengeful fury. He could end it. He could end the sniper who had hunted them. "Callan, no!" Rowan yelled. Callan's arm trembled. He looked at the pathetic, whimpering man. He looked at Rowan. With a roar of disgust, he did not strike. He hurled the knife, sending it spinning into a deep, muddy puddle. He grabbed Rourke by the collar. "Tell Vale," Callan spat, his face inches from the snipers, "that the Willow clan is coming, and we want answers." He threw Rourke back against the wall. "Guards in the alley!" Shouts echoed from the depot. They were trapped. The main street was their only way out. "We'll never make it." Callan panted, leaning against the wall. The ledger. Rowan looked at the book, soaked in rain and soot. "They have to know. The people." She saw it. A set of rickety wooden stairs leading up to the low, flat roof of the depot's front awning. "Give me a boost." Callan, understanding instantly, laced his fingers. She stepped into his hand, and he shoved her upward. She scrambled onto the low roof, just as 3 depot guards burst into the alley. Rowan stood up. She was on the awning, above the main street of Copper Bend, in the pouring rain. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the steam whistle and the shouting. "Murder!" Rowan screamed, her voice, raw and powerful, cutting through the storm. "Deacon Vale is a murderer." Vale himself appeared at the mouth of the alley, his face pale with fury. "Stop her! He murdered Federal Agent Ezra Voss," Rowan yelled. "The Carrick Burr Syndicate is selling guns to killers." She couldn't throw the ledger. It was the only complete copy. But she had the other papers. She ripped the folded freight receipt from her bodice, the receipt with Rourke's perfect, inky thumbprint. She pulled out the other manifests she'd grabbed, the ones detailing the cash bribes. "Here is your proof," she screamed. "Proof paid for in blood." And she threw the handful of papers into the wind. They scattered, fluttering down like wounded birds, landing on the wet awning, the muddy street, and the heads of the shocked crowd below. People scrambled, snatching the papers. The rain hit the ink, the neat script blurred, the names Pike and Voss smearing. But at the top of every single freight receipt, the heavy, printed block letters remained, stark and undeniable. Carrick Burr. The words, as the prompt foretold, burned black as sin. The guards were paralyzed, torn between grabbing Rowan and stopping the townsfolk from reading the evidence. It was the chaos she needed. "Kaelin, now!" she yelled. She ran to the edge of the awning and jumped, landing hard in the back of an open freight wagon. Callan, using his last strength, had pulled himself onto the wagon's tailgate. He grabbed her hand, and they tumbled out the other side, disappearing into a narrow passage between the saloon and the gunsmith. They ran. They didn't stop until they reached a livery stable on the edge of town. They collapsed behind a stack of hay, soaked, covered in soot, gasping for air. The ledger was safe, tucked under her dress. "We have to split up," Callan panted, the pain lines deep around his mouth. "They'll be looking for us together. The Red Willow Council," Rowan said, her hand on the hard rectangle of the book. "At sunset, I'll take the high trail. You follow the creek bed. They'll never look for you there." "Sunset," he agreed. "If I'm not there." She started, her voice tight. "If they catch me, I'm giving this book to Padre Olivares. I swear to God. I'll have him read it from the pulpit. One way or another, Vale's world ends today. You will be there." Callan said. It wasn't a hope. It was a statement of fact. He slipped out the back of the stable, a shadow disappearing into the rain. Rowan waited, her heart a painful drum. She bound her hair, wiped the soot from her face, and melted back into the street. As she reached the edge of Copper Bend, the rain began to ease. A break in the clouds showed the high, red cliffs to the north, circling low, just over the tree line. Was a single, red-tailed hawk. It drifted patiently, its eyes on the town. The Willow clan was here. They were waiting. The sun was a raw, molten wound, bleeding out over the western rim of the high plateau. It painted the great standing stones of the Red Willow Council in shades of crimson and violet. This was the sacred ground, the place where, for 1,000 years, the tribes of the high plateau had come to speak to the sky. The air was still, heavy with a silence that felt older than the stones. Rowan Hale limped into the vast, open clearing. The heavy, soot-stained ledger clutched to her chest. Her black widow's dress was torn and smeared with mud. She was no longer Mrs. Cole, but she was not yet Rowan Hale of Kestrel Bluff. She was something new, forged in the last 24 hours. She was alone. She had followed the high trail, as promised. But Callan, who had taken the low creek bed, was nowhere to be seen. Panic, cold and sharp, began to prickle at her resolve. What if he hadn't made it? What if his wound had finally claimed him? Then the sound came. It was not the far-off, desperate call she had heard at dawn. This was a reply, a deep, resonant hoo that rolled across the flats, seeming to come from the stones themselves. The slate horn, it was answered. From the north, a second horn. From the east, a third. Rowan turned, her heart leaping into her throat. The horizon, which had been empty, was suddenly alive. Dust. Not the thin, worried plume of a posse, but a vast, rising cloud of red earth, catching the last of the sun. It was a storm of horses. They came, not in a line, but in a great, broad wave, pouring out of the canyons and over the ridges. It was not a war party. It was a nation, a sea of riders. So many she could not count them. It was the Willow clan, the Stone Eaters, the Red Water people, the entire confederation of the High Plateau. They rode in, their faces painted not for war, but for solemn council. They carried lances and bows and rifles, but every weapon was sheathed or slung or resting in a saddle scabbard. This was a show of strength, not an act of aggression. The great wave of riders slowed, splitting into two rivers, flowing around the stone circle and coming to a stop, forming a vast, silent ring of mounted warriors, hundreds deep. The sound of their arrival was a low thunder of hooves, the jingle of bridles, the creak of leather, and then a profound, expectant silence. A path opened, down the center. One man rode. He was old, his face a map of the country itself, lined with wisdom and hard seasons. His long, silver-white hair was not in war braids, but bound, interwoven with the feathers of a mature, bald eagle. He sat on a black and white pony, carrying no rifle, only a single, symbolic staff. This was Chief Mato Gray Elk. He stopped his horse 20 feet from Rowan. He did not look at the ledger. He looked at her. His eyes were dark, clear, and saw everything. "You are the woman of the well," he said. His voice was not loud, but it carried across the entire clearing. "You brought water." "I am," Rowan said, her voice trembling but clear. "And I brought the truth. Where is our messenger? Where is Callan of the Willow clan?" A sound from the edge of the clearing. A horse stumbling. Callan. He was on foot, dragging himself, his face the color of wet ash, his hand pressed to his side. He had made it, but just barely. He staggered into the clearing and nearly fell. Rowan ran to him. She didn't think. She just moved, throwing her shoulder under his, taking his weight, just as she had done at the ranch. She half carried, half dragged him forward, the ledger still clutched in her other hand, as one. The mounted warriors of the high plateau raised their right hands, palm open. It was a salute. Chief Gray Elk dismounted. He watched as Rowan and Callan, supporting each other, walked the last few yards. As they passed the first line of dismounted warriors, a path of honor opened before them. An old woman, a sage mother, stepped forward and touched Rowan's shoulder as she passed. Then a warrior, then another. Hands, calloused and strong, brushed her arm, her back, her shoulder. It was not a threat. It was a welcome. It was the ritual, the touch of recognition for one who gives water to the thirsty. They reached the center. Callan sagged, but Rowan held him. "He carries the word," Gray Elk said, looking at the ledger. "And I carry the proof." Rowan answered, "Proof." A new voice, sharp and full of cold authority, cut across the field. "The only proof that matters is this." Row next in, their horses pushing arrogantly through the assembled lines, came Sheriff Luther Pike, Deacon Vale, and a dozen hired guns from the Carrick-Burr freight line. They looked confident, smug. Rourke was not with them. "This," Pike said, holding up a rolled parchment, "is a federal warrant issued by the territorial court for the arrest of one Rowan Hale for harboring a fugitive and accessory to the murder of Agent Ezra Voss." Deacon Vale smiled, a thin, reptilian stretching of his pale lips. He had cleaned the soot from his suit. He looked immaculate. "It's over, Miss Hale. You will hand over that stolen property and you will come with the sheriff. The law is the law." "The law, Mr. Vale." The voice came from behind Pike. A single rider, on a sweating roan, had followed them in. He was a man Rowan didn't know, with a weary face, a dusty coat, and a simple, silver star pinned to his vest. It was not a sheriff's star. "Acting Marshal Hart, from the Capitol," the man introduced himself, his eyes on Vale. "I've been riding for 2 days." "Marshal," Vale said, his smile tightening. "Your authority is welcome, but redundant. Sheriff Pike has this well in hand." "No, Mr. Vale," Hart said, unrolling a different paper. "He does not. As of sunrise this morning, on my authority as the ranking federal officer in this territory, Sheriff Luther Pike is suspended from all duties, pending a full investigation into the death of Agent Ezra Voss." Pike's face went white. "You can't do that." "I can," Hart said, his voice flat and tired. "Agent Voss sent me a telegram 2 days ago, naming you, naming Mr. Vale. I am here to take possession of his killer and his evidence." The silence was absolute. The power had shifted like a snake shedding its skin. Vale's composure cracked. "This is an outrage. That savage killed Voss." "Did he?" Chief Mato Gray Elk said, his voice cutting through. He stepped forward, his staff in his hand. "This is the Red Willow. This is the council ground. Here, we do not speak with paper. We speak before the sky. Put your truth in the circle." He pointed with his staff to a circle of flat, white stones in the center of the clearing. Rowan stepped forward first. She placed the heavy, rain-smeared ledger in the center. The Carrick-Burr ledger, showing payments to Deacon Vale and Luther Pike, showing the gun shipments, marked as agricultural tools. Lies forgery, Vale hissed. Rowan reached into her dress pocket. She pulled out the ink-smeared freight receipt. The receipt for one of the shipments, signed for at Mesquite Wash, by your man. My man, Vale sneered. Rowan! A new, desperate shout. Hawk-eyed Rourke staggered into the clearing, his left arm in a crude, bloody sling, his face a mask of terror. He had been captured by the High Plateau Scouts. 2 warriors shoved him forward until he stumbled and fell near the circle. Rourke. Vale's voice was a deadly whisper. Rowan laid the receipt down. With his thumbprint, in ink. Every eye, Vale's, Pike's, Hart's, and the eyes of 1,000 silent warriors fell on Rourke. Rourke looked at the ledger. He looked at the receipt with his own black print. He looked at the sea of hard, unblinking faces surrounding him. He saw no escape. He saw no mercy from Vale. And he saw a terrible, swift justice from the tribes. He made me, Rourke whimpered, pointing a shaking, unbroken finger at Deacon Vale. It was just paper. He said it was just paper. What did he make you do? Marshal Hart asked, his voice quiet. Bury the manifests, Rourke cried, tears of pain and fear cutting pale tracks through the grime on his face. The real ones, the ones from the army. He had me swap 'em. He paid me in silver from the syndicate to lose the shipping numbers, to sign for tools. It was him. It was all him. The confession hung in the air, damning and final. Deacon Vale's face was no longer pale. It was a mottled, furious red. But it was Pike who moved. He was a cornered animal. His career was over. His freedom was gone. He had nothing left but violence. With a raw-throated yell, he drew his pistol. Not on Vale, not on Hart, but on the one person who had caused it all. He grabbed Rowan, pulling her in front of him. The muzzle of his pistol pressed hard against her temple. No! Callan yelled, surging forward. Thwack! 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 It was not a gunshot. It was the sound of 100 bowstrings being drawn taut. In perfect, terrible unison, the entire first circle of High Plateau warriors raised their bows. An arrow knocked for Pike's heart. They did not fire. They just aimed. The silence was a razor's edge. The air was so still. Rowan could hear Pike's ragged, panicked breathing in her ear. Back off, Pike screamed, his voice cracking. All of you, or I'll end her right here, back off. Callan froze, his hand outstretched. Marshal Hart's hand was on his own pistol, but he didn't dare draw. Rowan did not struggle. She did not cry. She just stared, her eyes fixed on Callan. Then, slowly, she reached into the pocket of her torn dress. Don't move, Pike snarled, pressing the gun harder. It's just a piece of cloth, Rowan said, her voice shaking but hard. Her fingers closed around the rain-dampened silk. She pulled it out. The dark blue neckerchief, embroidered with a single letter E. It was stained, dark and stiff with the lifeblood of Ezra Voss. She didn't hand it to Hart. She threw it. It landed on the ground at Pike's feet. He was a traitor, Pike spat, his eyes wild. He was working with the savages. He was a federal agent. Rowan's voice rang out, clear and strong, echoing across the silent field. And those were his dying words. He said the ledger was in the safe, and he said to find the traitor wearing a star. She looked at Pike's chest, at the silver sheriff's star pinned there. Pike's finger tightened on the trigger. Callan took one step. Enough! Chief Mato Grey Elk's voice was not a shout. It was a judgment. He struck the ground with his staff. The sky has heard. The earth has seen. The evidence is laid. The confession is spoken. Pike flinched, his eyes darting from the chief to the bows. He was surrounded. We are a people of the law, Marshal, Grey Elk said, looking at Hart. The old law and the new. This man, he pointed at Vale, is yours. He then looked at Pike, who still held Rowan, the gun shaking in his hand. But this one has violated the sanctity of the well. He has brought war to a parley. The chief's eyes were like black ice. Justice, he declared, his voice rising for all to hear, will not be by bullet. It will be by the word that is sealed. The truth is now known. The sky itself seemed to hold its breath. The standoff was absolute. Pike, his hands shaking, his hostage in his arm, was a dead man. Surrounded by a justice he could not escape and 1,000 witnesses to his final, desperate act. Deacon Vale's mask of serene, untouchable authority shattered. He had built an empire on paper, on whispers, and on the quiet threat of violence. Now, with his power gone, his confession spoken, and his authority usurped, he was just a pale, sweating man in an expensive suit. But the snake, cornered, still has venom. "Fools!" he shrieked, his voice a thin, tearing sound in the vast, silent clearing. He was not shouting at Pike or at Marshal Hart. He was shouting at his own dozen hired guns, the syndicate men who sat frozen on their horses, caught between the federal marshal and the 1,000 drawn bows of the high plateau. "They cannot shoot all of us!" Vale screamed. "Fire, fire! You cowards earn your silver! Shoot them, shoot the chief!" The syndicate men were mercenaries, not soldiers. They were terrified. But one, a hard-faced man closest to Vale, had his loyalty bought and paid for. He ripped his repeating rifle from his saddle scabbard, his face a mask of panicked resolve. He started to level the rifle toward Motto Gray Elk, hawk-eyed Rourke. Clutching his broken wrist, was standing between the gunman and Vale. Rourke saw the motion. He saw the rifle lift. His eyes, the sharpest eyes in the territory, met the gunman's, and Rourke did nothing. He just watched, his face blank. He hesitated. It was not a long pause. It was a single, skipped heartbeat. It was the space between the lightning and the thunder. It was all the time Rowan Hale needed. Pike still held her, but Vale's scream had made him flinch. His attention had shifted, just for that split second, toward the new threat. His grip on Rowan's arm was iron, but the gun at her head wavered, his gaze darting to his allies. Rowan did not try to pull free. She did not try to run. She acted. She drove the heel of her boot down, hard, onto Pike's instep. A guttural gasp of pain exploded from the sheriff's throat. His grip on her arm became an involuntary clench, but his gun hand reflexively jerked up, the muzzle lifting clear of her temple. She wasn't free, but her right arm was. She didn't reach for his gun. She knew that fight. She reached behind him. His own lariat, the tool of his trade, was coiled on his saddle horn, less than 2 feet away. Her calloused fingers found the loop. With a desperate, underhand snap of her wrist, she threw it. It was not a long throw, maybe 15 feet. The syndicate gunman, his rifle now leveled, his finger tightening on the trigger, never saw it coming. The loop, thrown low and true, shot out, opening perfectly. It snapped shut, not around the man, but around the rifle in his arms, pinning them to his chest. Rowan didn't pull, she just fell. She dropped her entire weight, using Pike's bruising grip on her other arm as an anchor. The rope yanked taut. The gunman was ripped clean from his saddle, his shot going wild, a harmless explosion into the darkening sky. He hit the ground in a cloud of dust and curses. The wind knocked from his lungs. The sound of the shot was instantly followed by the sharp, flat thwack-thwack of 2 bowstrings. 2 of the other syndicate men, the ones who had been slower to draw, slumped in their saddles, an arrow suddenly sprouting from each of their chests. The high plateau warriors had not flinched. The remaining hired guns threw their hands high in the air, their faces pale with terror. The battle was over before it began. But the fight was not. Pike had lost. He roared, a sound of pure, cornered animal rage, and shoved Rowan away from him with all his strength. She stumbled and fell. He was a dead man, and he knew it. But he would not go alone. He fired. He wasn't aiming at her. He wasn't aiming at anyone. He was just a vessel of pure, destructive rage. Crack, the heavy slug from his pistol screamed across the clearing. It missed Rowan by a yard and struck one of the tall, sacred standing stones of the council's circle. A white scar of pulverized granite exploded from the ancient rock. The ping of the ricochet echoed across the field like a clap of doom. Cullen was already moving. He had been waiting, his entire body poised, ignoring the white-hot fire in his stitched-up side. The second Rowan was clear. He launched himself. It was not a duel. It was not a Western showdown. It was a desperate, ugly collision. Kalen, his wounded side screaming, slammed his good shoulder into Pike's gun arm. The two men went down, crashing into the sacred circle. A tangle of flailing limbs. Dust rose, choking them. It was raw, brutal, and graceless. Pike was heavier, stronger, fueled by a madman's strength. Kalen was fueled by a dying man's purpose. He hissed, a low sound of pure agony. As he tried to pin Pike's arm, Pike's gun hand was still free. He was rolling, trying to bring the pistol's muzzle up, to press it against Kalen's stomach and end it. Rowan scrambled to her feet. She looked for a weapon, a rock, a gun. She saw it, Chief Mato Gray Elk's staff, the one he had struck the ground with. It lay on the dirt where he had dropped it when Pike first grabbed her. It was a heavy, fire-hardened piece of willow, 4 feet long, with a shepherd's hook at the top. Pike was on top of Kalen now. The gun was moving, pressing in. Rowan didn't wait. She slid in on her knees, gripping the staff in both hands. She didn't aim for Pike's head. She couldn't risk hitting Kalen. She jammed the hooked end of the staff forward, catching the barrel of the pistol. She pulled, leveraging her entire body weight. The gun was yanked sideways, its aim spoiled. Pike fired again, the shot burying itself harmlessly in the dirt. He snarled, trying to rip the pistol free, but Rowan held the staff like it was her own life. Kalen's hand, slick with his own blood. Shot up. He didn't grab the gun. He jammed his thumb, hard, between the raised hammer and the percussion cap. Pike, his face purple, pulled the trigger a third time. Click. It was a dead, dull, metallic sound. The heavy hammer fell, but it crashed down on the flesh and bone of Kalen's thumb. Not the cap. The sound was small, but it cut through the grunting and the dust. It was the sound of the violence ending. The gun was useless. Before Pike could react, Marshal Hart was on him, his own pistol pressed to the back of Pike's head. "Luther Pike," Hart panted, his voice ragged with exhaustion. "You are under arrest for conspiracy, for murder, for treason." Hart's 2 deputies, who had been covering the crowd, moved in, yanking Pike's arms behind him and binding them with steel cuffs. Deacon Vale stood alone, frozen. His crisp suit was now splattered with mud. His mask of control was gone, leaving only the pale, trembling face of a man who had lost the entire world. He looked at his captured men. He looked at the 1,000 arrows, still aimed, silent and waiting. Marshal Hart walked over, snapping open a second pair of handcuffs. "Mr. Vale," Hart said, his voice cold, "I believe you have a ledger to explain to a federal judge, and a great many aggravated citizens." As if summoned by his words, a new sound rose from the edge of the clearing. It was the rumble of wagons, the murmur of many voices, the townsfolk from Copper Bend, drawn by the rumors, by the rain-smeared receipts, and by the sight of the marshal riding north. They had followed, a grim, curious crowd of miners, blacksmiths, ranchers, and merchants. They poured into the clearing, their eyes wide, taking in the scene the sea of warriors, the captured sheriff, the high-dollar politician in chains. "What is it?" a blacksmith called out, shouldering his way to the front. "What's in that book?" Marshal Hart, seeing the 50 or more angry, determined faces, made a decision. He didn't close the ledger. He left it open on the stone, in the fading light. The townsfolk surged forward. They crowded around the stone, their faces lit by the setting sun. "That's," a woman whispered, her hand flying to her mouth. She pointed at a signature. "That's my husband's name. That's his mark. Vale said he said it was a fee, a territorial fee for our water rights." "And mine," a freight hauler growled, his voice thick with a sudden, terrible understanding. "He called it an expediting bond. Took 10% of my contract. The man's been bleeding us all." The blacksmith roared, recognizing his own cramped signature on a high-interest loan he'd taken from the syndicate. "He's been funding this war with our money. He's been paying Pike to terrorize us all." The anger in the crowd was a low, rising hum, a different kind of threat. Justice wasn't just for the high plateau. It was for every man and woman Vale had cheated. The sun had almost vanished. The tension of the fight was gone, replaced by a weary, profound quiet, broken only by the angry murmurs of the crowd. Chief Mato Grey Elk retrieved his staff from Rowan. He looked at the white, scarred wound on the sacred stone where Pike's bullet had struck. His face was grim. He turned to Rowan, who was on her knees, helping Callan press a cloth to his crushed, bleeding thumb. Grey Elk raised his voice. It was not a shout of war, but a declaration of judgment, for his people and for the newly arrived townsfolk to hear. "For many moons," he said, "our lands have been scorched by fire, by the guns of men who profit from the blood of our children, and the blood of your children." He looked at Vale, his eyes as cold as the high mountain springs. "They brought fire. Then," he turned to Rowan. He took her hand, the one that had thrown the rope, the one that had held the staff. He raised it high for all to see. "And this woman," he declared, "when she found our messenger dying at her well, brought him water. She is the one who brought water when others brought fire." A deep murmur of assent. "How?" ran through the 1,000 warriors. It was the highest honor. From the circle of elders, 3 women, the sage mothers, walked forward. Their faces were lined and beautiful, their gray hair in long, simple braids. They wore necklaces of polished blue stone. They stopped in front of Rowan. The eldest one held a simple strand of blue beads, the color of deep, clean water, the color of the sky. She did not ask permission. She simply placed the necklace over Rowan's head. It settled on her collarbone, the stones cool against her soot-stained skin. "The well is the mouth of the earth," the old woman said, her voice like the rustling of dry, sacred leaves. "The spring is its heart. You have honored the water. You are now a sister of the spring. You have a place here." It was done. Pike, defeated and bound, was being hauled to his feet by Marshal Hart's deputies. His face was a mask of dirt, sweat, and a pure, undiluted hatred that had curdled into madness. He looked at Rowan, receiving the honor. He looked at Callan, alive. He looked at Rourke, who was being given water by one of the townsmen. It was too much, the humiliation, the loss of his power. His hands were cupped in front of him. With a sudden, snake-like twist, his hand darted, not for a gun, but for the thin-bladed knife he had always kept tucked in his boot. He was going to take one of them with him. He lunged, a single, broken step toward Rowan. Callan was too wounded to stop him. Hart was too far away. "No." Hawk-eyed Rourke moved, his one good arm shooting out with a sniper's speed. He didn't try to fight. He didn't try to strike. He simply stepped in the way, his hand clamping down on Pike's cuffed fists, his grip like a steel trap. He stopped the knife blade inches from his own chest. Pike struggled, roaring, but Rourke held him. He held him, his face full of a terrible, final exhaustion. "It's done, Luther," Rourke whispered, his voice broken. "Enough! It's enough!" Pike sagged. The last of the fight went out of him. The knife clattered from his numb, bound fingers onto the stones. Marshal Hart and his men dragged him away. Silence fell again. Callan looked at the arrows, still nocked, still aimed. He looked at Chief Grey Elk. The chief raised his staff. As one, a sound like 1,000 sighs. 1,000 bowstrings relaxed. The warriors lowered their weapons. Not a single arrow had been fired to kill. The peace had held. Justice had been delivered, not by a massacre, but by the weight of the ledger, the courage of a woman, and the final confession of a broken man. Marshal Hart, his face grim, walked to the center of the circle. "Chief Mato Grey Elk," he said, "the territorial court will honor the word of Agent Voss. We will honor this ledger. The Carrick and Burr syndicate will be broken, and we are ready to speak of peace." Grey Elk nodded. He turned to one of his warriors, who brought forward a long, simple pole, unadorned. The chief took a bolt of clean, white cloth, a flag of parley. He planted the staff deep in the mound of earth at the center of the circle. in the very spot where Pike's wild shot had scarred the ground. The white cloth, the new flag of peace, shivered and snapped in the rising evening wind, a stark, clean promise against the blood-red sky. Night fell, not with a sudden, violent drop, but as a slow, deep blue exhale over the high plateau. The anger of the sunset had faded, leaving a sky punched full of cold, clear stars. So many they looked like spilled salt. Where there had been a field of tension, 1,000 drawn bows, there was now a community. A great circle of campfires bloomed in the darkness, hundreds of small, quiet lights ringing the central standing stones. The air was cool, smelling of juniper smoke and roasted corn. The only sound was the steady, solemn beat of a single large drum, a rhythm slow and deep, like the heartbeat of the earth itself. Marshal Hart, his deputies, and his prisoners were long gone. The townsfolk from Copper Bend, their anger now cold and focused, had departed with them, eager to see justice served in the capital. Rourke, having given his testimony, had been taken into federal protection as a material witness. Now, only the High Plateau Nation remained, and Rowan. She sat near the central fire, her borrowed black dress in tatters, her skin still smeared with soot and alley mud. The blue beads the sage mothers had given her were cool against her collarbone. Kalen sat near her. The tribe's healers had cleaned and restitched his wound, binding his crushed thumb in a poultice of willow bark and sage. He was pale, exhausted, but his eyes, fixed on her, were brighter than the firelight. The drumbeat stopped. The low murmur of 1,000 voices went silent. Chief Mato Gray Elk stood, his silver hair seeming to glow. He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. The white flag of parley flies over the stone that was wounded. He declared, "The paper truth and the blood truth have spoken. The men of fire have been taken by their own law." He turned, his dark, clear eyes finding Rowan. He motioned for her to stand. She rose, her legs unsteady, the weight of the last 2 days settling on her. "You came to us as a stranger," the chief said. "You stood on your own land, and when our messenger was dying, you gave him water. You hid the truth from our enemies. You honored the spring." He stepped forward and placed his hand on her shoulder. "We do not forget such a debt. We do not have a word for what you are in your tongue, so we give you one in ours." He spoke the name, a series of soft, flowing syllables. Mni Wikoni Ozuha. He paused, letting the name settle on her. "It means, Keeper of the Spring's Mouth. You are no longer an outsider. Rowan Hale, you are a sister of the spring. You have a place here. You have a voice at this council. Always." A low, resonant murmur of approval. How ran through the entire circle of warriors. It was done. She had a name. She had a people. The drum began its slow beat again. The ceremony was over. Rowan slowly sat, her mind reeling, her hand touching the cool stones at her neck. Kalen moved, not with his warrior's grace, but with the stiff pain of his injuries. He knelt before her. It was not a gesture of supplication. It was a gesture of profound respect. "Keeper of the Spring's Mouth," he said, the name sounding right in his voice. "It is a good name." "Kalen," she whispered, her throat tight. "I just gave you water." "You gave me life," he corrected, his voice low. He held something in his good hand. It was not a weapon. It was a staff, a ceremonial lance, polished by generations of hands until the wood felt like smooth, cool glass. The point was not steel, but a head of chipped black obsidian. The shaft was wrapped in leather dyed a deep, rich blue, and inlaid with the same blue glass beads that were in her necklace. "This," he said, "was my grandfather's, and his father's. It is the staff of the Spring Watcher, the one who is chosen to guard the sacred Red Willow Spring, the heart of our nation." He pressed the heavy, balanced staff into her hands. "I cannot," she breathed, overwhelmed. "This is your family, your people." "It is," he said, his gaze locked with hers. "It is a token. It is not a gift that is given lightly. It is not given without complete trust." Her fingers closed around the smooth, Cool wood. It felt solid, real, a promise, a covenant. She had given him water from a wooden bucket. He was giving her a symbol of the water itself. The air around the fire was thick with smoke, with the smell of food, with the quiet talking of families. It was too public, too loud for the world that had passed between them, for the memory of the salt cave, for the terror in the alley, for the way he had looked at her when she threw the rope. "Walk with me," he said. His voice a murmur meant only for her. She nodded. She stood, helping him to his feet. He was steadier now, the healer's work and the relief of victory giving him a new, if fragile, strength. They left the circle of firelight. No one stopped them. They walked past the standing stones, past the silent, watchful sentries, the sound of the drum and the voices fading behind them. They followed the whisper of water, moving through the darkness toward the stream that bordered the council grounds. They stopped at the bank of the silver thread. The stream ran clear and cold, the starlight shivering on its fast-moving surface. The air here was cool, misty, and clean, smelling of wet rock and high country pine. It was the first truly peaceful moment Rowan had known since she'd first seen the blood at her well. They stood side by side, two shadows in the starlight, looking at the water. The silence between them was not empty. It was full of unspoken words, of shared terror, of a bond forged in gunpowder and soot. "Rowan," he began, his voice rough. "Kaelin," she said at the same exact moment. They both stopped, and a small, weary breath of a laugh escaped her. They turned to face each other, and in the quiet of the night, the dam of exhaustion, of duty, of holding the entire world at bay, finally broke. He raised his good hand, the one that was not bound. He did not touch her face, not yet. He touched the blue necklace. His calloused, warm fingers brushed the skin of her collarbone. A touch so light it was almost not there. It was a question. She answered by closing her eyes, her breath catching. He stepped closer, into her space. He pressed his forehead against hers, just as he had in the absolute darkness of the salt cave. But this was not a desperate huddle for warmth. This was a deliberate, knowing connection. Their breath, visible as faint plumes in the cool, misty air, mingled. She could feel the slow, steady rhythm of his breathing, an anchor against the frantic, joyful hammering of her own heart. "You are safe," he whispered, and she realized he was the one who was trembling, the last of the battle shock finally leaving his body. "So are you," she whispered back. Her hands came up. She wanted to hold him, to reassure herself he was real, that he was alive. But she stopped, her hands hovering, afraid to hurt his wounded side, his bound hand. He sensed her hesitation. He took both of her hands in his good one, lacing his fingers with hers, strong and sure. He guided their joined hands, pressing them to his chest, flat against his heart, beneath her palm, through the rough cotton of his shirt. She felt it, his heart, beating, strong and steady. For her, he leaned in, and his lips found hers. It was not the desperate, fevered, and fleeting kiss from the cave. This was a kiss of choice, of certainty. It was slow and deep, and it took her breath. It tasted of wood smoke in the clear, cold night. It was a kiss of profound, staggering relief, a kiss that spoke of a promise fulfilled. It was long and unhurried, a quiet, claiming truth in the darkness. It was a sealing of the covenant. When he pulled back, they were both breathless. She did not move away. She couldn't. She sagged against him, and his good arm, the strong one, came around her waist, pulling her flush against his solid frame. It was not a rough gesture. It was an embrace of absolute possession, of pure protection. He held her as if she were the only solid thing in a spinning world, his anchor. She rested her head on his shoulder, her hands still linked with his, pressed warm between their bodies. She could feel the hard, lean muscle of his chest, the solid line of his shoulder, the heat of him through the thin layers of their clothes. It was an embrace that spoke of a shared harbor, found after a storm that should have drowned them both. It was respectful, it was reverent, and it was deeply, powerfully passionate. A fire banked low and burning steady, all the more intense for its quiet. "I used to dream," she murmured, her voice muffled against his shoulder, her eyes closed, "of just surviving, of my cattle having enough water, of my fences holding out the wolves." "And now?" he asked, his voice a low rumble against her ear. She pulled back just enough to look up at him. The starlight was in his eyes. "Now," she said, her voice catching, "I dream of a ranch where the cattle aren't afraid of the sound of gunfire, a real house on Kestrel Bluff, made of pine, with a porch, a place where children, all children, yours and mine, learn to read from the same book, and the first word they learn is water, and the second word is ours." A smile, the first true, unguarded smile she had ever seen from him, transformed his face. It erased the pain, the exhaustion. "That," he said, his voice thick, "is a good dream. It is a dream worth building." He touched her cheek, his rough thumb gently brushing away a smudge of soot. "Tomorrow, I ride with Marshal Hart to the capital. I will stand in the territorial court. I will speak the truth of Ezra Voss. I will be the witness that buries Deacon Vale and the entire Carrick Burr syndicate." Her heart, which had been soaring, suddenly fell. "You're leaving." "I am leaving," he said, his gaze intense. "So that I can return. I will testify. I will see the treaty signed, the one Voss died for, and then—" He leaned in, his lips brushing hers again. A soft promise. "Then I'm coming back to Juniper Flats. I'm coming back to you, and I'm going to build that aqueduct, the one that will feed your well and my people's spring. I will keep my promise. Rowan, I will keep the spring clean." Dawn came, not with fire, but with a clean, pale, promising light. The great circle of the high plateau was breaking camp. Rowan watched from the edge of the clearing as the nation mounted. They were not a conquering army, nor a defeated people. They were witnesses. They had come not to bring war, but to see that justice for once was done. They filed out in a long, orderly procession, a river of horses and proud riders, fading back into the high canyons, their duty complete. Callan, mounted on a fresh horse given to him by the chief, rode to where she stood. He looked down at her, his face grim with the purpose of the day ahead. "At Juniper Flats," he said. It was not a question. "At the well," she replied. He nodded once, turned his horse, and rode to join Marshal Hart's column. He was the messenger, and his message was finally being delivered. She rode Dustfinch home. The journey that had taken an eternity of terror took less than 2 hours in the clear morning light. Her ranch was scarred, but standing. The feed shed was a pile of black ash. The chalk mark, Pike's mark, was still on her gatepost. The sod house was silent, empty. She walked, stiff and sore, to the center of her world, to the well. She looked down into its dark, cool depths, at the water that had started it all. She heard the hoofbeats of the last riders fade over the ridge. She was alone again, a woman on a ranch, with a herd to find and a life to rebuild. But she was not the same woman. She touched the blue beads at her throat. She was the keeper of the spring. A sound behind her, a single horse, walking. She spun, her hand flying to the knife she still wore. Callan was sitting on his horse, just inside the gate, watching her. "You didn't go," she whispered, her heart stopping. "Marshal Hart has my sworn statement. He has the ledger. He has Rourke's confession." Callan said. He swung down from the saddle, wincing as his feet hit the ground. "He has enough to hang them all. My word is given. My job as a messenger is done." He walked toward her, his step slow but steady. He stopped just in front of her. "My job as a builder," he said, his eyes finding hers, "is about to begin." Rowan looked at him, at the man who had been shot, hunted, and had saved her life. She looked at his face, no longer a stranger's, but the one face in all the world she could trust. "The first line of that aqueduct," she said, her voice catching, "starts right here." Callan smiled. That slow, true smile. He reached out, not for an embrace, not for a kiss, but for her hand. He took it, lacing his fingers with hers, the calluses of her palm fitting perfectly against his. Rowan Hale stood by her well, no longer a lone widow, but the keeper of the spring. She held the hand of the warrior who had come back for her, and together they looked out at the parched, promising land, ready to begin. Thank you for listening to this story. I'd love to know where you are tuning in from in the world, so please drop a comment below and share your thoughts. Be sure to subscribe to my channel, Wild West Stories 1850, and like this video. It also helps so much if you support the channel by hitting that hype button, so this story can be heard by even more people.